Baron Trump's Marvellous Underground Journey by Ingersoll Lockwood, author of Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog, Bulger, Wonderful Deeds and Doings of Little Giant Boab and His Talking Raven Tabib, Extraordinary Experiences of Little Captain Doppelkop on the Shores of Bubbleland, etc. Biographical notice of Wilhelm Heinrich, Sebastian von Troomp, commonly called Little Baron Trump. As doubting Thomases seem to take particular pleasure in popping up on all occasions, jack-in-the-box-like, it may be well to head them off in this particular instance by proving that Baron Trump was a real baron, and not a mere baron of the mind. The family was originally French Huguenot de la Troomp, which, upon the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, took refuge in Holland, where its head assumed the name of Van de Troomp, just as many of the other French Protestants rendered their names into Dutch. Some years later, upon the invitation of the Elector of Brandenburg, Nicholas van der Troomp became a subject of that prince, and purchased a large estate in the province of Pomerania, again changing his name, this time to Von Troomp. The little baron, so called from his diminutive stature, was born sometime in the latter part of the 17th century. He was the last of his race in the direct line, although cousins of his are today well-known Pomeranian gentry. He began his travels at an incredibly early age, and filled his castle with such strange objects picked up here and there in the faraway corners of the world, that the simple-minded peasantry came to look upon him as half bigwig and half magician. Hence the growth of the many myths and fanciful stories concerning this indefatigable globetrotter. The date of his death cannot be fixed with any certainty, but this much may be said. Among the portraits of Pomeranian notables hanging in the Rathaus at Stettin, there is one picturing a man of low stature, and with a head much too large for his body. He is dressed in some outlandish costume, and holds in his left hand a grotesque image in ivory, most elaborately carved. The broad face is full of intelligence, and the large gray eyes are lighted up with a good-natured but quizzical look that invariably attracts attention. The man's right hand rests upon the back of a dog sitting on a table and looking straight out with an air of dignity that shows that he knew he was sitting for his portrait. If a visitor asks the guide who this man is, he always gets the answer, "Oh, that's the little baron." But the little baron who? That's the question. Why may it not be the famous Wilhelm Heinrich Sebastian von Troomp, commonly called Little Baron Trump, and his wonderful dog Bulger? Chapter 1. A Marvellous Underground Journey. Bulger is greatly annoyed by the familiarity of the village dogs and the presumption of the house cats. His health suffers thereby, and he implores me to set out on my travels again. I readily consent, for I had been reading of the world within a world in a musty old miss written by the learned Don Fume. Parting interviews with the elder baron and the gracious baroness, my mother. Preparations for departure. Bulger was not himself at all, dear friends. There was a lackluster look in his eyes, and his tail responded with only a half-hearted wag when I spoke to him. I say half-hearted, for I always had a notion that the other end of Bulger's tail was fastened to his heart. His appetite, too, had gone down with his spirits, and he rarely did anything more than sniff at the dainty food which I set before him, although I tried to tempt him with fried chicken's livers and toasted coxcombs, two of his favorite dishes. There was evidently something on his mind, and yet it never occurred to me what that something was, For to be honest about it, it was something which of all things I never should have dreamed of finding there. Possibly I might have discovered at an earlier day what it was all about, had it not been that just at this time I was very busy, too busy, in fact, to pay attention to anyone, even to my dear four-footed foster brother. As you may remember, dear friends, my brain is a very active one, and when I once became interested in a subject, Castle Troomp itself might take fire and burn until the legs of my chair had become charred before I would hear the noise and confusion, or even smell the smoke. It so happened at the time of Bulger's low spirits that the elder Baron had, through the kindness of an old school friend, come into possession of a 15th century manuscript from the pen of a no less celebrated thinker and philosopher than the learned Spaniard Don Constantino Bartolomeu Strefalo Fig Garaniusfum, commonly known among scholars as Don Fum, entitled A World Within a World. In this work, Don Fum advanced the wonderful theory that there is every reason to believe that the interior of our world is inhabited, that it is well known that the vast earth ball is not solid, on the contrary, being in many places quite hollow, that ages and ages ago terrible disturbances had taken place on its surfaces and had driven the inhabitants to seek refuge in these vast underground chambers, so vast, in fact, as well to merit the name of A World Within a World. This book, with its crumbled, torn, and time-strained leaves, exhaling the odors of vaulted crypt and worm-eaten chest, exercised a peculiar fascination upon me. All day long, and often far into the night, I sat poring over its musty and mildewed pages, quite forgetful of this surface world, and with the plummet of thought sounding these subterranean depths, and with the eye and ear of fancy visiting them, and gazing upon and listening to the dwellers therein. While I would be thus engaged, Bulger's favorite position was on a quaintly embroidered leather cushion brought from the Orient by me on one of my journeys, and now placed on the end of my work table nearest the window. From this point of vantage, Bulger commanded a full view of the park, and the terrace, and of the drive leading up to the porte cochere. Nothing escaped his watchful eye. Here he sat hour by hour, amusing himself by noting the comings and goings of all sorts of folk, from the hawkers to the gewgaws to the noblest people in the shire. One day my attention was attracted by his suddenly leaping down from his cushion and giving a low growl of displeasure. I paid little heed to it, but to my surprise, the next day, about the same hour, it occurred again. My curiosity was now thoroughly aroused, and lying down Don Fum's musty manuscript, I hastened to the window to learn the cause of Bulger's irritation. Lo, the secret was out. There stood 6 mongrel curs belonging to the tenantry of the baronial lands, looking up to the window, and by their barking and antics, endeavoring to entice Bulger out for a romp. Dear friends, need I assure you that such familiarity was extremely distasteful to Bulger? Their impudence was just a little more than he could stand. Ringing my bell, I directed my servant to hunt them away, whereupon Bulger consented to resume his seat by the window. The next morning, just as I had settled myself down for a good long read, I was almost startled by Bulger bounding into the room with eyes flashing fire and teeth laid bare in anger. Laying hold of the skirt of my dressing gown, he gave it quite a savage tug, which meant, "Put thy book aside, little master, and follow me." I did so. He led me downstairs, across the hallway, and into the dining room, and then this new cause of discontent on his part became very apparent to me. There, grouped around his silver breakfast plate, sat an ancient tabby cat and 4 kittens, all calmly licking or lapping away at his breakfast. Looking up into my face, he uttered a sharp, complaining howl, as much as to say, "There, little master, look at that! Isn't that enough to roil the patience of a saint? Canst thou wonder that I am not happy with all these disagreeable things happening to me? I will tell thee, little master, it is too much for flesh and blood to put up with. And I thought so too, and did all in my power to comfort my unhappy little friend. But judge of my surprise upon reaching my room and directing him to his place on his cushion, to see him refuse to obey. It was something extraordinary and set me to thinking. He noticed this and gave a joyful bark, then dashed into my sleeping apartment. He was gone for several moments and then returned bearing in his mouth a pair of oriental shoes which he laid at my feet. Again and again he disappeared, coming back each time with some article of clothing in his mouth. In a few moments, he had laid a complete oriental costume on the floor before my eyes. And would you believe me, dear friends, it was the identical suit which I had worn on my last travels in faraway lands, when he and I had been wrecked on the island of Gogula, the land of the round bodies. What did it all mean? Why, this, to be sure. Little master, canst thou not understand thy dear Bulger? He is weary of this dull and spiritless existence. He is tired of this increasing familiarity on the part of these mongrel curs of the neighborhood, and the audacity of these kitchen tabbies and their families. He implores thee to break away from this life of reverie and inaction, and for the honor of the Troomps to be up and away again. Stooping down and winding my arms around my dear Bulger, I cried out, "Yes, I understand thee now, faithful companion, and I promise thee that before this moon has filled her horns, we shall once more turn our backs on Castle Troomp, up and away in search of the portals to Don Foom's world within a world." Upon hearing these words, Bulger broke out into the wildest, maddest barking, bounding hither and thither, as if the very spirit of mischief had suddenly nestled in his heart. In the midst of these mad gambols, a low rap on my chamber door caused me to call out, "Peace, peace, good Bulger, someone knocks. Peace, I say." It was the elder baron. With somber mien and stately tread, he advanced and took a seat beside me on the canopy. "Welcome, honored father," I exclaimed, as I took his hand and raised it to my lips. "I was upon the very point of seeking thee out." He smiled and then said, "Well, little baron, what thinkest thou of Don Foom's world within a world?" "I think, my lord," was my reply, "that Don Foom is right, that such a world must exist, and with thy consent it is my intention to seek out in search of its portals with all safe haste, and as soon as my dear mother, the gracious Baroness, may be able to bring her heart to part with me." The elder baron was silent for a moment and then added, "Little baron, much as thy mother and I shall dread to think of thy being again out from under the safe protection of this venerable roof, the moss-grown tiles of which have sheltered so many generations of the Troomps, yet must we not be selfish in this matter. Heaven forbid that such a thought should move our souls to stay thee. The honor of our family, thy fame as an explorer of strange lands and faraway corners of the globe, call unto us to be strong-hearted. Therefore, my dear boy, make ready and go forth once more in search of new marvels. The learned Don Foom's chart will stand thee by like a safe and trusty counselor. Remember, little baron, the motto of the Troomps, per ardua ad astra. The pathway to glory is strewn with pitfalls and dangers, but the comforting thought shall ever be mine, that when thy keen intelligence fails, Bulger's unerring instinct will be there to guide thee." As I stooped to kiss the elder baron's hand, the gracious Baroness entered the room. Bulger hastened to raise himself upon his hind legs and lick her hand in token of respectful greeting. The tears were pressing hard against her eyelids, but she kept them back, and encircling my neck with her loving arms, she pressed many and many a kiss upon my cheeks and brow. "I know what it all means, my dear son," she murmured with the saddest of smiles, "but it shall never be said that Gertrude Baroness von Troomp stood in the way of her son adding new glories to the family's scutcheon. Go, go, little baron, and heaven bring thee safely back to our arms and to our hearts in its own good time." At these words, Bulger, who had been listening to the conversation with pricked ears and glistening eyes, gave one long howl of joy, and then springing into my lap, covered my face with kisses. This done, he vented his happiness in a string of ear-splitting barks and a series of the maddest gambols. It was one of the happiest and proudest days of his life, for he felt that he had exerted considerable influence in screwing to the sticking point my resolution to set out on my travels once again. And now, the patter of hurrying feet and the loud murmur of anxious voices resounded through the castle corridors, while inside and out ever and anon I could hear the cry now whispered and now outspoken, "The little baron is making ready to leave home again." Bulger ran hither and thither, surveying everything, taking note of all the preparations, and I could hear his joyous bark ring out as some familiar article used by me on my former journeys was dragged from its hiding place. 20 times a day my gentle mother came to my room to repeat some good counsel or reiterate some valuable caution. It seemed to me that I had never seen her so calm, so stately, so lovable. She was very proud of my great name, and so, in fact, were every man, woman, and child in the castle. Had I not gotten off as I did, I should have been literally killed with kindness, and Bulger slain with sweet cake. Chapter 2. Don Fum's Mysterious Directions. Bulger and I set out for Petersburg, and thence proceed to Archangel. The story of our journey as far as Illich on the Illich. Ivan the Teamster. How we made our way northward in search of the portals to the world within a world. Ivan's threat. Bulger's distrust of the man and other things. According to the learned Don Fum's manuscript, the portals to the world within a world were situated somewhere in northern Russia. Possibly, so he thought, from all indications, somewhere on the westerly slope of the upper Urals. But the great thinker could not locate them with any accuracy. "The people will tell thee," was the mysterious phrase that occurred again and again on the mildewed pages of this wonderful writing. "The people will tell thee." Ah, but what people will be learned enough to tell me what? Was the brain-racking question which I asked myself, sleeping and waking, at sunrise, at high noon, and at sunset, at the crowing of the cock, in the silent hours of the night. "The people will tell thee," said learned Don Fum. Ah, but what people will tell me where to find the portals of the world within a world? Hitherto on my travels, I had made choice of a semi-oriental garb, both on account of its picturesqueness and its lightness and warmth. But now, as I was about to pass quite across Russia for a number of months, I resolved to don the Russian national costume. For speaking Russian fluently, as I did a score or more other languages living and dead, I would thus be enabled to come and go without everlastingly displaying my passport, or having my trains of thought constantly disturbed by inquisitive traveling companions, a very important thing to me, for my mind possessed the extraordinary power of working out automatically any task assigned to it by me, provided it was not suddenly thrown off its track by some ridiculous interruption. For instance, I was upon the very point one day of discovering perpetual motion, when the gracious Baroness suddenly opened the door and asked me whether I had pared the nails of my great toes lately, and as she had observed that I had worn holes in several pairs of my best stockings. It was about the middle of February when I set out from the Castle Troomp, and I journeyed night and day in order to reach Petersburg by the 1st of March, for I knew that the government trains would leave that city for the White Sea during the first week of that month. Bulger and I were both in the best of health and spirits, and the fatigue of the journey didn't tell upon us in the least. The moment I arrived at the Russian capital, I applied to the Emperor for permission to join one of the government trains, which was most graciously accorded. Our route lay almost directly to the northward for several days, at the end of which time we reached the shores of Lake Ladoga. This we crossed on the ice with our sledges, as a few days later we did Lake Onega. Thence by land again we kept on our way until Onega Bay had been reached, crossing it, too, on the ice, and so reaching the station of the same name, where we halted for a day to give our horses a well-deserved rest. From this point we proceeded in a straight line over the snowfields to Archangel, an important trading post on the White Sea. As this was the destination of the government train, I parted with its commandant after a few days' pleasant sojourn at the government house, and set out, attended only by my faithful Bulger and 2 servants, who had been assigned to me by the imperial commissioner. My course now carried me up the river Dwina as far as Solvitchegodst. Thence I proceeded on my way over the frozen waters of the Wichedga River until we had reached the government post of Yarensk, and from there on we headed due east until our hardy little horses had dragged us into the picturesque village of Illich on the Illich. Here we were obliged to abandon our sledges, for the snows had disappeared like magic, uncovering long vistas of green fields, which in a few days the May sun dotted with flowers and sweet shrubs. At Illich I was obliged to relinquish from my service the 2 faithful government retainers who had accompanied me from Archangel, for they had now reached the most westerly point which they had been commissioned to visit. I had become very much attached to them, and so had Bulger, and after their departure we both felt as if we were now, for the first time, among strangers in a strange land. But I succeeded in engaging, as I thought, a trustworthy teamster, Ivan by name, who made a contract with me for a goodly wage to carry me 100 miles farther north. "But not another step farther, little baron," said the fellow doggedly. I was now really at the foothills of the northern Urals, for the rocky crests and snow-clad peaks were in full sight. I turned many a wistful look up toward the wild regions shut in by their sheer walls and parapets, shaggy and bristling with black pines, for a low, mysterious voice came a-whispering in my inward ear that somewhere in that awful wilderness, I should one day come upon the portals of the world within a world. In spite of all I could do, Bulger took a violent dislike to Ivan and Ivan to him, and if the bargain had not been made and the money paid over, I should have looked about me for another teamster. And yet it would have been a foolish thing to do, for Ivan had 2 excellent horses, and I saw at a glance, and what's more, he took the best of care of them, at every post rubbing them until they were quite dry, and never thinking of his own supper until they had been watered and fed. His tarantass, too, was quite new and solidly built, and well furnished with soft blankets. All in all, as comfortable as you can make a wagon which has no other springs than the 2 long wooden supports that reach from axle to axle. True, they were somewhat elastic, but I could notice that Bulger was not over fond of riding in these curious vehicles with its rattly bang gait up and down these mountain roads, and often asked permission to leap out and follow on foot. At length Ivan reported everything in readiness for the start, and although I would have fain taken my departure from Illich on the Illich in as quiet a manner as possible, yet the whole village turned out to see us off, Ivan's family, father, mother, sisters, brothers, and wife and children, uncles and aunts and cousins by dozens alone, making up enough people to stock a small town. They cheered and waved their kerchiefs. Bulger barked, and I smiled and raised my cap with all the dignity of a Troomp. And so we got away at last from Illich on the Illich, Ivan on the box, and Bulger and I at the back, sitting close together like 2 brothers that we were. 2 breasts with but a single heartbeat, and 2 brains busy with the same thought, that come perils or come sudden attacks, some covert danger or bold and open-faced onslaught, we should stand together and fall together. Many and many a time as Ivan's horses went crawling up the long stretches of mountain road, and I lay stretched upon the broad cushioned seat of the tarantass, with a blanket rolled up for a pillow, I would find myself unconsciously repeating those mysterious words of Don Fum, "The people will tell thee, the people will tell thee." So steep were the roads that some days we would not make it more than 5 miles, and on others a halt of several hours would have been made to enable Ivan to tighten his horse's shoes, grease the axles, or do some needful thing in or about his wagon. It was slow work, aye, it was very slow and tedious. But what matters it how many or great the difficulties to a man who has made up his mind to accomplish a certain task? Do the storks or the wild geese stop to count the thousands of miles between them and their faraway homes when the time comes to turn their heads southward? Do the brown ants pause to count the hundreds of thousands of grains of sand which they must carry through their long corridors and winding passages before they have burrowed deep enough to escape the frost of midwinter? There had been many Troomps, but never one that had thrown up his arms and cried, "I surrender." And should I be the first to do it? Never. Not even if it meant never to see dear old Castle Troomp again. One morning, as we went zigzagging up a particularly nasty bit of mountain road, Ivan suddenly wheeled about and without even taking off his hat, cried out, "Little Baron, I covered the last mile of the 100 today. If thou wouldst go any farther north, thou must hire thee another teamster. Dost hear?" "Silence," I said sternly, for the fellow had broken in upon a very important train of thought. Bulger, too, resented the man's insolence, and growled and showed his teeth. "But, little Baron, listen to reason," he continued in a more respectful tone, removing his cap. "My people will expect me back. I promised my father. I'm a dutiful son. Nay, nay, Ivan," I interrupted sharply. "Curb that tongue of thine, lest it harm thy soul. Know then that I spoke with thy father, and he promised me that thou shouldst go a second 100 miles with me, if need were, but on condition that I give thee double pay. It shall be done, and on top of that a goodly present for your Golubchika, darling." "Little Baron, thou art a hard master," whimpered the man. "If the whim took thee, thou wouldst bid me leap into the giant's well, just to see whether it has a bottom or not. St. Nicholas, save me." "Nay, Ivan," said I kindly. "I know no such word as cruelty, although I do confess that right seems harsh at times. But thou wert born to serve and I to command. Providence hath made thee poor and me rich. We need each other. Do thou thy duty, and thou wilt find me just and considerate. Disobey me, and thou wilt find that this short arm may be stretched from Illich to Petersburg." Ivan turned pale at this hidden threat of mine, but I deemed it necessary to make it, for I as well as Bulger had scented treachery and rebellion about this boorish fellow, whose good trait was his love of his horses, and it was always been my rule of life to open my eyes wide to the good that there is in a man, and close them to his faults. But in spite of kind words and kind treatment, Ivan grew surlier and moodier the moment we passed the 100th milestone. Bulger watched him with a gaze so steady and thoughtful that the man fairly quailed before it. Hour by hour he became more and more restive, and upon leaving a roadside tavern, for the very first time since we had left Illich on the Illich, I noticed that the fellow had been drinking too much kvass. He let loose his tongue and raised his hand against his horses, which until that moment he had been wont to load down with caresses and pet names. "Look out for that driver of thine, little Baron," whispered the tavern keeper. "He's in a reckless mood. He'd not pull up if the giant's well were gaping in front of him. St. Nicholas have thee in his safe keeping." Chapter 3. Ivan more and more troublesome. Bulger watches him closely. His cowardly attack upon me. My faithful Bulger to the rescue. A driver worth having. How I was carried to a place of safety. In the hands of old Juliana. The giant's well. When we halted for the night, it was only by threatening the man with severe punishment upon my return to Illich that I could bring him to rub his horses dry and feed and water them properly. But I stood over him until he had done his work thoroughly, for I knew that no such horses could be had for love or money in that country, and if they should go lame from standing with wet coats in the chill night air, it might mean a week's delay. Scarcely had I thrown myself on the hard mattress, which the tavern keeper called the best bed in the house, when I was aroused by loud and boisterous talking in the next room. Ivan was drinking and quarreling with the villagers. I strode into the room with the arrows of indignation shooting from my eyes, and the faithful Bulger close at my heels. The moment Ivan set eyes upon us, he shrank away, half in earnest and half in jest, and called out, "Hey, look at the Mazunchik, little dandy. How smart he looks. He frightens me. See his eyes, how they shine in the dark. Look at the little demon on 4 legs beside him. Save me, brothers, save me. He will throw me down into the giant's well. Maryanka will never see me again, never. Save me, brothers." "Peace, fellow," I called out sternly. "How darest thou exercise thy dull wit on thy master? Get thee to bed at once, or I'll have thee whipped by the village constable for thy drunkenness." Ivan clambered up onto the top of the bake-oven and stretched himself out in a sheepskin. Then, turning to the tavern keeper, I forbade him under any pretext whatever to give my servant any more liquor to drink. "Ach, Vasha Prevoshaditsterva." "Ah, your excellency," exclaimed the tavern keeper with a gesture of disgust, "the fools never know when they have had enough. It matters not what the tavern keeper may say to them. They tell us not to spoil our own trade. Ah, they don't know when to stop. They have throats as deep as the giant's well." "The giant's well, the giant's well," I murmured to myself, as I again threw myself down upon the bag of hay which did service as a mattress for those who could afford to pay for it. It's strange how those words seem to be in every peasant's mouth, but I thought no more about it at that time. Sleep got the better of me, and with my usual good night to the elder baron and the gracious baroness, my mother, I dropped off into sweet forgetfulness. It is a good thing that I had the power of falling asleep almost at will, for with my restless brain ever throbbing and pulsating with its own overabundance of strength, ever tapping at the thin panels of bone which covered it, like an imprisoned inventor pounding on his cell door, and pleading to be let out into the daylight with his plans and schemes, I should simply have become a lunatic. As it was, with the mere power of thought, I ordered sweet slumber to come to my rescue, and so obedient was this good angel of mine that all I had to do, simply, was to set the time when I wished to awaken, and the thing was done to the very minute. As for Bulger, I never pretended to lay down any rules for him. He made it a practice of catching 40 winks when he was persuaded that no danger of any kind threatened me. And even then, I'm half inclined to believe that like an anxious mother over her babe, he never quite closed both eyes at once. Though entirely sobered by daybreak, yet Ivan went about the task of harnessing up with such an ill grace that I was obliged to reprove him several times before we had left the tavern yard. He was like a vicious but cowardly animal that quails before a strong and steady eye, but watches its opportunity to spring upon you when your back is turned. I not only called Bulger's attention to the fellow's actions, and warned him to be very watchful, but I also took the precaution to examine the priming of the brace of Spanish pistols which I carried thrust into my belt. We had scarcely pulled out into the highway when a low growl from Bulger aroused me from a fit of meditation, and this growl was followed by such an anxious whine from my 4-footed brother as he raised his speaking eyes to me, that I glanced hastily from one side of the road to the other. Lo and behold, the treacherous Ivan was deliberately engaged in an attempt to overturn the tarantass, and to get rid of his enforced task of transporting us any further on our journey. "Wretch!" I cried, springing up and laying my hand on his shoulder. I perceive very plainly what thou hast in mind, but I warn thee most solemnly that if thou makest another attempt to overturn thy wagon, I'll slay thee where thou sittest." For only answer, and with a lightning-like quickness, he struck a backhand blow at me with the loaded end of his whipstock. It took me full in the right temple, and sent me to the bottom of the tarantass like a piece of lead. For an instant, the terrible blow robbed me of my senses, but then I saw that the cowardly villain had turned in his seat and had swung the heavy-handled whip aloft with intent to dispatch me with a second and surer blow. Poor fool, he reckoned without his host, for with a shriek of rage, Bulger leaped at his throat like a stone from a catapult and struck his teeth deep into the fellow's flesh. He roared with agony and attempted to shake off this unexpected foe, but in vain. By this time, I had come to a full realizing sense of the terrible danger Bulger and I were both in, for Ivan had dropped his whip and was reaching for his sheath knife. But he never gripped it, for a well-aimed shot from one of my pistols struck him in the forearm, for I had no wish to take the man's life, and broke it. The shock and the pain so paralyzed him that he fell over against the dashboard half in a faint, and then rolled away completely out of the wagon, dragging Bulger with him. The horses now began to rear and plunge. I saw no more. There was a noise as of the roar of angry waters in my ears, and then the light of life went out of my eyes entirely. I had swooned dead away. It seemed to me hours that I lay there on my back in the back of the tarantass, with my head hanging over the side, but of course it was only minutes. I was aroused by a prickling sensation in my left cheek, and as I slowly came to myself, I discovered that it proceeded from the gravel thrown up against it by one of the front wheels of the tarantass, for the horses were galloping along at the top of their speed, and there on the driver's seat sat my faithful Bulger, the reins in his teeth, bracing himself so as to keep them taut over the horses' backs. And as I sat up and pressed my hand against my poor hurt head, the whole truth broke upon me. The moment Ivan had struck the ground, Bulger had released his hold upon the fellow's throat, and ere he had had a chance to revive, had leaped up into the driver's seat, and catching up the reins in his teeth, had drawed them taut, and thus put an end to the rearing and plunging of the frightened beasts, and started them on their way, leaving the enraged Ivan brandishing his knife and uttering imprecations upon mine and Bulger's heads, as he saw his horses and wagon disappear in the distance. Now it was that a mad shouting assailed my ears, and I caught a glimpse of half a dozen peasants who, seeing this, as they thought, empty tarantass come nearer and nearer with its galloping horses, had abandoned their work and rushed out to intercept it. Judge of their amazement, dear friends, as their eyes fell upon the calm and skillful driver bracing himself on the front seat, and with oft-repeated backward tosses of his head urging those horses to bear his beloved master farther and farther away from the treacherous Ivan's sheath knife. As the peasants seized the animals by the heads and brought them to a standstill, I staggered to my feet and threw my arms around my dear Bulger. He was more than pleased with what he had done, and licked my bruised brow with many a piteous moan. "St. Nicholas, save us!" cried one of the peasants, devoutly making the sign of the cross. "But if I should live long enough to fill the giant's well with pebbles, I never would expect to see the like of this again." The giant's well, I murmured to myself as I followed one of the peasants to his cot, standing a little back from the highway, for I stood sore in need of rest after the terrible experience I had just had. The blow of Ivan's whip handle had jarred my brain, and I was skilled enough in surgery to know that the hurt called for immediate attention. As good luck would have it, I found beneath the peasant's roof one of those old women, half-witches, perhaps, who had recipes for everything, and who know an herb for every ailment. After she had examined the cut made by the loaded whip handle, she muttered out, "It is not as broad as the mountain, nor as deep as the giant's well, but it's bad enough, little master." The giant's well again, thought I, as I laid me down on the best bed they could make up for me. I wonder where it may be, that giant's well, and how deep it is, and who drinks the water that is drawn from it. Chapter 4. My wound heals. Juliana talks about the giant's well. I resolve to visit it. Preparations to ascend the mountains. What happened to Juliana and to me? Reflection and then action. How I contrived to continue the ascent without Juliana for a guide. It was a day or so before I could walk steadily, and meantime I made usual efforts to keep my brain quiet. But in spite of all I could do, every mention of the giant's well by one of the peasants sent a strange thrill through me, and I would find myself suddenly pacing up and down the floor, and repeating over and over again the words, "Giant's well, giant's well." Bulger was greatly troubled in his mind, and sat watching me with a most bewildered look in his loving eyes. He had half a suspicion, I think, that cruel blow from Ivan's whip handle had injured my reasoning powers, for at times he uttered a low, plaintive whine. The moment I took notice of him, however, and acted more like myself, he gamboled about me in the wildest delight. As I had directed the peasants to drive Ivan's horses back towards Illich on the Illich, until they should meet that miscreant and deliver them to him, I was now without any means of continuing my journey northward, unless I set out, like many of my famous predecessors, on foot. They had longer legs than I, however, and were not loaded with so heavy a brain in proportion to their size, and a brain, too, that scarcely ever slept, at least not soundly. I was too impatient to reach the portals to the world within a world to go trudging along a dusty highway. I must have horses and another tarantass, or at least a peasant's cart. I must push on. My head was quite healed now, and my fever gone. "Hearken, little master," whispered Juliana. Such was the name of the old woman who had taken care of me. "Thou art not what thou seemst. I never saw the like of thee before. If thou wouldst, I believe thou couldst tell me how high the sky is, how thick through the mountains are, and how deep the giant's well is." I smiled, and then I said, "Didst ever drink from the giant's well, Juliana?" At which she wagged her head and sent forth a low chuckle. "Hearken, little master," she then whispered, coming close to me and holding up one of her long, bony fingers. "Thou canst not trick me. Thou knowest the giant's well hath no bottom." "No bottom," I repeated breathlessly, as Don Fume's mysterious words, "the people will tell thee," flashed through my mind. "No bottom, Juliana?" "Not unless thine eyes are better than mine, little master," she murmured, nodding her head slowly. "Listen, Juliana," I burst out impetuously. "Where is this bottomless well? Thou shalt lead me to it. I must see it. Come, let's start at once. Thou shalt be well paid for thy pains." "Nay, nay, little master, not so fast," she replied. "It's far up the mountains. The way is steep and rugged. The paths are narrow and winding. A false step might mean instant death, were there not some strong hand to save thee. Give up such a mad thought as ever getting there, except it be on the stout shoulders of some mountaineer." "Ah, good woman," was my reply, "thou hast just said that I am not what I seem, and thou saidst truly. Know then, when thou seest before thee the world-renowned traveller, Wilhelm Heinrich Sebastian von Troomp, commonly called Little Baron Trump, that though short of stature and frail of limb, yet what there is of me is of iron. There, Juliana, there's gold for thee. Now lead the way to the giant's well." "Gently, gently, little baron," almost whispered the old peasant woman, as her shriveled hand closed upon the gold piece. "I have not told thee all. For leagues about, I ween, no living being except me knows where the giant's well is. Ask them, and they'll say, it's up yonder in the mountains, away up under the eaves of the sky. That's all. That's all they can tell thee. But, little master, I know where it is, And the very herb that cured thy hurt head and saved thee from certain death by cooling thy blood was plucked by me from the brink of the well. These words sent a thrill of joy through me, for now I felt that I was on the right road, that the words of the great master of all masters, Don Fume, had come true. The people will tell thee. Aye, the people had told me, for now there was not the faintest shadow of doubt in my mind that I had found the portals to the world within a world. Juliana should be my guide. She knew how to thread her way up the narrow pass, to turn aside from overhanging rocks which a mere touch might topple over, to find the steps which nature had hewn in the sides of the rocky parapets, and to pursue her way safely through clefts and gorges, even the entrance to which might be invisible to ordinary eyes. However, in order that the superstitious peasants might be kept friendly to me, I gave it out that I was about to betake myself to the mountains in search of curiosities for my cabinet, and begged them to furnish me with ropes and tackle, with 2 good stout fellows to carry it for me, promising generous payment for the services. They made haste to provide me with all I asked for, and we set out for the mountain path at daybreak. Juliana, in order not to seem to be of the party, had gone on ahead by the light of the moon, telling her people that she wished to gather certain herbs before the sun's rays struck them and dried the healing dew that beaded their leaves. All went well until the sun was well up over our heads, when suddenly I heard a woman, who proved to be Juliana, utter a piercing scream. In a moment or so the mystery was solved. The old beldam came rushing down the mountain, her thin wisp of grey hair fluttering in the wind. Her hands were tied behind her, and 2 young peasants with birchen rods were beating her every chance they got. Turn back, brothers," they cried to my 2 men. "The little wizard there has struck hands with this old witch. They're on their way to the giant's well. They'll loosen a band of black spirits about our ears. We shall all be bewitched. Quick, quick, cast off the loads you're bearing and follow us." The 2 men didn't wait for a second bidding, and throwing the tackle on the ground, they all disappeared like a flash. But for several moments I could hear the screams of poor Juliana as these young wretches beat the old woman with their birchen rods. Well, dear readers, what say ye to this? Was I not in a pleasant position, truly? Alone with Bulger in that wild and gloomy mountain region, the black rocks hanging like frowning giants and ogres over our heads, with the dwarf pines for hair, clumps of white moss for eyes, vast gaping cracks for mouths, and gnarled and twisted roots for terrible fingers, ready to reach down from my poor little weazen frame. Did I fall a-trembling? Did I make haste to follow those craven spirits down the mountainside? Did I shift the peg of my courage a single hole lower? Not I. If I had, I wouldn't have been worthy of the name I bore. What I did do was to throw myself at full length on a bed of moss, call Bulger to my side, and close my eyes to the outer world. I have heard of great men going to bed at high noon to give themselves up to thought, and I had often done it myself before I had heard of their doing it. In 15 minutes, by nature's watch, the sun on the face of the mountain, I had solved my problem. Now there were 2 difficulties staring me in the face, namely, to find somebody to show me the way up the mountain, and if that body couldn't carry my tackle, then to find somebody else who could. It suddenly occurred to me that I had noticed some cattle grazing at the foot of the mountain, and what's more, that these cattle wore very peculiar yokes. What are those yokes for? I asked myself, for they were of a make quite different from any that I remembered ever having seen, and consisted of a stout wooden collar, from the bottom of which there projected backward between the beast's 4 legs a straight piece of wood armed with an iron spike pointing toward the ground. At the top the yoke was bound by a leather thong to the animal's horns, so long, therefore, as the beast held his head naturally, or even lowered it to graze, the yoke was drawn forward and the hook was kept free from the ground. But the very moment the animal raised his head into the air, At once the hook was thrown into the ground, and he was prevented from taking another step forward. Now, dear readers, you may or may not know that when a cleft-hoofed animal starts to ascend a steep bank, unlike a solid-hoofed beast, he throws his head into the air instead of lowering it, and therefore it struck me at once that the purpose of this yoke was to keep the cattle from making their way up the sides of the mountain and getting lost. But why should they want to clamber up the mountainsides? Simply because there was some kind of grass or herbage growing up there which was a delicacy to them, and knowing as well as I did what risks animals will take and what fatigue they will undergo to reach a favorite grazing ground, it struck me at once that if I would make it possible for them to reach this favorite food of theirs, they would be very glad to give me a lift on my way. No sooner said than done. I forthwith retraced my steps until I fell in with a group of these cattle, and it did not take me many minutes to loosen their yokes from their horns and tie the hooks up under their bodies so that their progress uphill would not be interfered with. They were delighted to find themselves so unexpectedly freed from the hateful drawback which permitted them merely to view the coveted grazing grounds from afar. And then, having cut me a suitable goad, I again started up the mountain, driving my new friends leisurely on ahead of me. Upon reaching the spot where the superstitious peasants had thrown the tackle to the ground, I proceeded to load it upon the back of the gentlest beast of the lot, and was soon on my way again. Chapter 5. Up and still up, and through the quarries of the demons. How the cattle kept the trail, and how we came at last upon the brink of the giant's well. The terraces are safely passed. Beginning of the descent into the well itself. All difficulties overcome. We reach the edge of Polyphemus's funnel. Generally speaking, people with very large heads are fitted out by nature with a pair of rather pipe-stemmy legs, but such was not my case. I was blessed with legs of the sturdiest sort, and found no difficulty in keeping pace with my new four-footed friends who, to my delight, were not long in convincing me that they had been there before. Not for an instant did they halt at any fork in the path, but kept continually on the move, often passing over stretches of ground where there was no trail visible, but coming upon it again with unfailing accuracy. Once only they halted, and that was to slake their thirst at a mountain rill, Bulger and I following their example. It was only too evident to me that they had in mind a certain grazing ground, and were resolved to be satisfied with no other. So I let them have their own way, for, as it was still up, I felt that it was perfectly safe to follow their lead. At last the mountainside began to take on quite another character. The gorges grew narrower, and at times overhanging rocks shut out the sunlight almost entirely. We were entering a region of peculiar wildness and fantastic grandeur. I had often read of what travelers term the quarries of the demons in the northern Urals, but never till now had I the faintest notion of what the expression meant. Imagine to yourself the usual look of ruin and devastation around and about a quarry worked by human hands. Then in your thoughts conceive every chip to be a block, and every block a mass. Add 4 times its size to every slab and post and pediment, and then turn a mighty torrent through the place, and roll and twist and lift them up in wild confusion, end and on each other piled, till these wild waters have builded fantastic portals to temples more fantastic, and arched wild gorges with roofs of rock, which seem to hang so lightly that a breath or footfall might bring them down with a terrible crash. And then, dear friends, you may succeed in getting a faint idea of the wild and awful grandeur of the scene which now lay spread out before me. Would the cattle that had now led Bulger and me so safely up the mountainside know where to find an entrance to this wilderness of broken rock? And what was more important still, would they, when once engaged within its winding courts and corridors, its darkened maze of wall and parapet, its streets and plazas roughly paved as if by demon hands impatient of the task, know how to find their way out again? Dear friends, man has always been too distrustful of his four-footed companions. They have much that they might tell us had they put speech to tell with it. I have often trusted them when it would have seemed foolhardy to you, and never once had I cause to repent of doing so. So Bulger and I, with stout hearts, followed straight after these silent guides, although I must confess my legs were beginning to feel the terrible strain I had put them to. But I resolved to push on ahead, at least until we had cleared the demon's quarry, and then to bring my little herd to a halt and pass the rest of the day and the night season in well-earned repose. Once within the quarry, however, all sense of fatigue vanished, and my thankful mind, entranced and fascinated by the deep silence, the awful grandeur, the mysterious lights and shadows of the place, lent me new strength. At length we had traversed this city of silence and gloom, and once again we emerged into the full glory of the afternoon sun. Suddenly, my little drove of cattle, with playful tossing of their heads, broke into a run. Bulger and I at their heels, however. It was a mad race, but dear friends, when it ended, I took off my fur cap and tossed it high into the air with a wild cry of joy, and Bulger broke out in a string of yelps and barks. For, look ye, the cattle were grazing away for dear life there in front of me, and as their breath reached me, my keen nostrils recognized the odor of Juliana's herbs, which she had bound on my hurt head. Yes, we stood almost upon the brink of the giant's well, but I was too tired to take another step farther, too tired, in fact, to eat, although I had a stock of dried fruit in my pockets, and noticed that the nests of the wild fowl were well supplied with eggs. Having unloosened the tackle from the back of the good beast that had carried it up the mountain for me, I threw myself on the ground and was soon fast asleep, with my faithful Bulger coiled up close against my breast. In the morning, the cattle were nowhere to be seen, but I didn't trouble myself about them, for I knew that old Juliana would be sent up after them the moment that they were missed. After a hearty breakfast on half a dozen roasted eggs of the wild fowl, with some dried fruit and wintergreen berries, Bulger and I advanced to the edge of the giant's well, or rather, to the edge of the vast terraces of rock leading down to it, each of which was from 30 to 50 feet in sheer height. Before I go any farther, dear friends, I must beg you to remember that I am an expert in the use of tackle, there being no knot, noose, or splice known to a sailor which I didn't have at my fingers' ends, a fact not to be wondered at when you take into consideration the thousands of miles which I have traveled on water. Nor would I have you shake your heads and look only half persuaded when I go on describing our descent into the giant's well, for, of course, you'll be asking yourselves how I succeeded in getting the tackle down, when there was no one left at the other end to untie it. Know, then, that was the smallest of my troubles, for as any sailor will tell you, you need only tie your line in what is known as a fool's knot, to one end of which you make a fast mere cord. The moment you've reached the bottom, a sharp tug at the cord unties the fool's knot, and your tackle falls down after you. My method was to lower Bulger down first, and then let myself down after him. In this way we proceeded from parapet to parapet, until at last we stood upon the very edge of the vast well, the existence of which had been so mysteriously hinted at in Don Fume's manuscript. Its mouth was probably 50 feet in width, and by straining my eyes I satisfied myself of the existence of a shelf of rock on one side, as nearly as I could judge about 75 feet down. It was a goodly stretch and would require every foot of my rope. You will not smile, I'm sure, when I tell you that I pressed Bulger to my breast, and kissed him fondly before lowering away. He returned my caresses, and by his joyous yelp gave me to understand that he had perfect faith in his little master. In a few moments, I had joined him on this narrow shelf of rock. Below us now was darkness, but think you I hesitated? I knew that my eyes would soon become accustomed to the gloom, and I also knew that when my eyes failed, Bulger's keener ones were there to help me out. I rigged my tackle now with extra care, for I was really lowering my little brother on a sort of trip of discovery. He was soon out of sight, and then, in spite of my calmness, I drew a quick breath, and my heart started upward a barleycorn or so. But hark! His quick, sharp bark comes plainly up to me. It means that he has landed upon a safe shelf or ledge, and the next moment my legs encircled the rope and I began to glide noiselessly down into the stilly depths, his glad voice ringing in my ears. Again and again did I send my wise and watchful little brother down ahead of me, until at last, standing there and looking up, naught remained to me of the mighty outside world but a bright silver speck, like a tiny ray of light streaming through a pinhole in the curtains of your chamber. But stop! Have we reached the bottom of the giant's well? For with a trial plummet I find that the walls are no longer sheer. They slope inward, and gently too. Almost so much that I hardly need a line to continue my descent. Lighting one of my little tapers, I make my way cautiously around the edge. In half an hour I find myself back at the starting place. The curves to the path have always been the same, while my trial plummet at all times has indicated the same slope to the rocky basin. And then for the first time, two certain words made use of by that learned master of masters, Don Fume, till then a mystery to me, stood out before my eyes as if written with a pen of fire upon those black walls thousands of feet below the great world of light which I had quitted a few hours before. Those words were Polyphemus's funnel. Yes, there could be no doubt of it. I had reached the bottom of the giant's well. I stood upon the edge of Polyphemus's funnel. Chapter 6. My despair upon finding the pipe of the funnel too small for my body. A ray of hope breaks in upon me. Full account of how I succeeded in entering the pipe of the funnel. My passage through it. Bulger's timely aid. The marble highway and some curious things concerning the entrance to the world within a world. The rocky sides of Polyphemus's funnel were apparently as well polished as those of any tin funnel that I had ever seen hanging in the kitchen of Castle Troomp. So making fast my tackle and taking Bulger in my arms, away we went sliding down the side with the line passed under my arm for safety's sake. It was nearly 100 feet to the bottom, for I had measured off the full length of my line before I had come to the apex of this gigantic cone, and not caring to tumble headlong down its pipe, I proceeded to light a taper and look about me. Ah, dear friends, I can feel that shudder now, so terrible was it. And what wonder, too, for a glance at the pipe of the funnel told me that it was too small to let my body pass through. The agonizing thought flashed through my mind that I had committed a terrible error, that I had mistaken some vast pit for the giant's well, that I had thrown Bulger's and my own life away in mad and unreasoning haste, that I should never reach the wonderful world within a world, that there, in that thick gloom, must we lay our bodies and bones. Or, thought I, may not the learned master of masters, Don Fume, have made an error himself in holding out the idea that the pipe of Polyphemus's funnel was large enough to admit the passage of a man's body? In my almost frenzy I advanced to the mouth of the pipe, and lowering myself into it, let my body sink as far as it would. It caught at the shoulders, and after a careful examination, I was forced to reach the brain-racking conclusion that my faithful Bulger and I had traveled our last mile together. There was nothing for us to do but to lie down and die. Lie down and die? Never. I had noticed in making the descent into the giant's well that its sides had much the appearance of being walled around by blocks of stone. With Bulger strapped to my back, I would slowly climb up from shelf to shelf until my strength failed me, and then I would wait until I thought old Juliana had come back to gather herbs, and possibly I might make her hear me. In my despair, I sighed and clutched my own arms, and as I did so, one of my hands came into contact with something cold and slippery, having the feel of tallow. Taking a pinch of the substance between my thumb and finger, I rubbed it thoughtfully for a moment, and then a ray of hope broke through the awful gloom that enshrouded me so piteously. It was black lead. There could be no doubt of it. It had made its way through a crack or crevice in Polyphemus's funnel, and I had rubbed it off in sliding down the side. With this greasy material to rub on the inside of the pipe to the funnel, and also to besmear myself with, mayhap I might yet slip through into the world within a world. At any rate, I determined to make the trial, even if I left some of my skin on the flinty rock. In order to collect my thoughts thoroughly, and that I might proceed step by step in that systematic order so characteristic of all my wonderful exploits, I sat down, and putting my arm around dear Bulger's neck and drawing him up against me, I communed with myself for a good half-hour. Then all was in readiness for action, and to prove it to you, dear friends, how careful Bulger was not to interrupt my train of thought, I have to report to you that although a small animal of a rat family came out from a crevice in the rock while I sat there thinking, as I could see by the light of the tiny wax taper, and had the temerity first to sniff at Bulger's tail, and then to give it a playful nip, yet the sagacious animal never budged a hair's breadth. "Mind hath ordered, now let hands obey," I exclaimed, as I sprang up and began stripping off my outer garments. This done, I clambered up on the side of the funnel and began to collect a supply of the black lead, which I deposited near the opening of the pipe. The next thing to do was to get Bulger through the pipe ahead of me. To this end, I tied him up in my clothing, bag fashion, and began to lower away. After paying out 65 or 70 feet of the line, he struck the bottom, and by his loud barking gave me to understand that it was all right, that I might make the descent myself. Upon hearing his voice, I gave the line a few sharp tugs. He was not slow to comprehend my meaning, and in a moment or so had not only scrambled out of the bag himself, but pulled my clothing loose so that I might draw the line up again. My next step was to contrive a way to weight myself when the moment arrived to begin the descent, for I felt sure that I should never be able to arrange it so as to slip through the pipe unless something was pulling at my heels. Cutting off about 10 feet of the rope, I made fast one end of the piece to a long piece of rock, weighing about 100 pounds. This I laid near the mouth of the pipe ready for use. But now came the most difficult thing of all. It was to draw my shoulders in on my breast and lash them securely in that position, by which plan I expected to reduce my width by at least 2 good inches. These 2 inches thus gained, or rather lost, might be the means by which I would be able to slip through the pipe of Polyphemus's funnel, and reach the vast underground passage leading to the world within a world. Putting a noose around my chest, just below my collarbone, I drew my shoulders in as tight as I could bear, and changed the slip knot into a hard one. Then, having made the other end of the line fast to the side of the funnel, I proceeded to wind myself up, as the housewives often do, a big sausage to keep it from bursting. This done, I set about rolling in the black lead until I was thoroughly smeared with it. There was now but one thing more to do before dropping myself into the pipe, and that was to make fast the weight to my feet. It was no easy task, wound up as I was, with my arms lashed down against my body, but by the use of slip knots I finally accomplished the feat, and sitting down, put my legs into the pipe and drew a long breath, for I felt as if I was being skewered up in a straitjacket. Bending down, I called out to Bulger, He answered with a yelp of joy that brought fresh vigor to my heart. Now was come the supreme moment, which was to witness success or failure. Failure, oh, what a dread word is that! And yet how often must human lips pronounce it, and in so doing breathe out the sigh in which it ends. Quickly lowering the weight, I wriggled off the edge of the opening and straightened myself out as I slipped into the pipe. Had I stopped it like a cork, or was I moving? Yes, down, down, gently, slowly, noiselessly, I went slipping through the pipe to Polyphemus's funnel. What did I care about how that weight caused the line to cut into my ankles? I was moving. I was drawing nearer and nearer to Bulger, whose joyous bark I could hear now and then, nearer to the inner gates of the world within a world. But woe is me, I suddenly stopped, and in spite of all my efforts to start again by twisting, turning, and shaking my body, it refused to sink another inch, and there I stick. Oh, Bulger, Bulger, I moan, faithful friend, if thou couldst but reach me, one tug from thee might save thy little master. In a sort of wild and desperate way, I now began to feel about me as well as I could, with my hands wedged in so close to my sides. But in a moment or so I had discovered the cause of my coming to such a sudden standstill. I had struck a portion of the pipe that had a thread to it, like that which encircles a bolt of iron and makes a screw of it, and the thought came to me that if I could only succeed in giving a revolving motion to my body, I would with every turn twist myself farther down toward the end of the pipe. I could feel that my knuckles and fingertips were being bruised and lacerated by this arduous work. But what cared I for the keen pain that darted from hands to wrists and wrists to elbows? It was like twisting a screw slowly through a long nut. Only the thread in this case was on the nut and the grooves in the screw. And that the screw was my poor bruised little body. All of a sudden, by the swinging of the weight, I could tell that it was passed out at the lower end of the pipe. It was pulling cruelly hard on my tender ankles, but I could twist myself no more. My strength was gone. I was at the point of swooning when I heard Bulger utter a loud yelp, and the next instant there was such a strong tug at my ankles that I sent forth a groan. But that tug saved me. It was Bulger who had leaped into the air and, catching the rope in his teeth, had dragged his little master out of the pipe of Polyphemus's funnel. We all fell into the same heap, Bulger and I, and the weight, fully 10 feet, and very serious might have been the consequences for me had my fall not been broken by my striking on the pile of my clothing placed directly under the opening. And dear friends, if you talked until the crack of doom, you could not make me believe that my 4-footed brother hadn't placed those clothes there to catch me. They weren't thrown higgledy-piggledy into a heap either. They were laid one upon the other, the heaviest at the bottom. Having unwound myself and lighted one of my wax tapers, I made haste to cast away the undergarment with its coating of black lead and resume my clothing. Then, stooping down, I made an examination of the floor. It was composed of huge blocks of marble of various colors, polished almost as smooth as if the hand of man had wrought the work. And then I knew that I was on nature's marble highway, leading to the cities of the underworld which Don Fume had mentioned in his book. And I remembered, too, that he had spoken of nature's mighty mosaics, huge fantastic figures on the walls of these lofty corridors, made up of various colored blocks and fragments laid one upon the other, as if with design, and not by the wild tempestuous whims of upbursting forces thousands of years ago, when the earth was in its mad and wayward youth. After a rest of several hours, during which I nursed my torn hands and bruised fingers, Bulger and I were up and off again along this broad and glorious marble highway. Strange to say, it was not the inky darkness of the ordinary cavern which filled these magnificent chambers, through which the marble highway went winding in stately and massive grandeur. Far from it. The gloom was tempered by a faint glow that met us on the way ever and anon, like a ray of twilight gone astray. Anyway, Bulger, I noticed, could see perfectly well. So tying a bit of twine to his collar, I sent him on ahead, convinced that I could have no surer guide. At times, our path could be lighted up for an instant by the bursting out of a little tongue of flame either on the sides or from the roof of the gallery. I was puzzled for quite a while to tell what it proceeded from, but at last I caught sight of the source, or rather the maker, of this welcome illumination. It proceeded from a lizard-like animal, which, by suddenly uncoiling its tail, had the power to emit this extremely bright flash of phosphorescent light, and in so doing he made a sharp crack, for all the world like the noise of an electric spark. Bulger was delighted with his performance, and on one occasion, not being able to control his feeling, he uttered a sharp bark, whereupon apparently 10,000 of these little torchbearers snapped their tails at me at the same instant, and filled the vast place with a flash of light almost lightning-like intensity. Bulger was so frightened by the result of his applause that he took good care to keep quiet after this. Chapter 7. Our First Night in the Underground World, and How It Was Followed by the First Break of Day. Bulger's Warning and What It Meant. We fall in with an inhabitant of the world within a world. His name and calling. Mysterious return of night. The land of beds and how our new friend provided one for us. So heavy with sleep did my eyelids become at last that I knew that it must be night in the outer world, and so we halted, and I stretched myself at full length on that marble floor, which, by the way, was pleasantly warm beneath us. And the air, too, was strangely comforting to the lungs, there being a complete absence of that smell of earth and odor of dampness so common in vast subterranean chambers. My sleep was long continued and most refreshing. Bulger was already awake, however, when I sat up and tried to look about me. He began tugging at the string which I had fastened to his collar, as if he wanted to lead me somewhere. So I humored him and followed along after. To my delight, he led me straight to a pool of deliciously sweet and cold water. Here we drank our fill, and after a very frugal breakfast on some dried figs, set out again on our journey along the marble highway. Suddenly, to my more than joy, the faint and uncertain light of the place began to strengthen. Why, it seemed almost as if the day of the upper world were about to break. So delicate were the various hues in which the ever-increasing light clothed itself. Then, as if affrighted at its own increasing glory, it would fade away again to almost gloom. Ere many moments again, this faint and mysterious glow would return, beginning with the softest yellow, then changing through a dozen different tints, and, like a fickle maid uncertain which to wear, put all aside and don the lily's garb. Bulger and I wandered along the marble highway almost afraid to break a stillness so deep that it seemed to me as if I could hear those sportive rays of light in their play against the many-colored rocks arching this mighty corridor. Now, as the marble highway swept around in a graceful curve, a dazzling flood of light burst upon us. It was sunrise in the world within a world. Whence came this flood of dazzling light which now caused the sides of the arching roof to glow and sparkle as if we had suddenly entered one of nature's vast storehouses of polished gems? Shading my eyes with my hand, I looked about me in order to try and solve the mystery. It did not take me long to understand it all. Know then, dear friends, that the ceilings, domes, and arched roofs of this underground world were fretted with a metal of greater hardness than any known to us children of sunshine. Its seams ran hither and thither like the veins of gigantic leaves, and at certain hours currents of electricity from some vast internal reservoir of nature's own building streamed through these metal traceries until they glowed with a heat so white as to give off the flood of dazzling light of which I have already spoken. The current never came with a sudden rush or burst, but began gently and timidly, so to speak, as if feeling its way along. Hence the beautiful tints that always preceded sunrise in this lower world, and made it so much like the coming and going of our glorious sunshine. The marble highway now divided, and the two halves of the fork curving away to the right and left, enclosed a small but exquisitely ornamented park, or pleasure ground, I might call it, provided with seats of some dark wood beautifully polished and carved. This park was ornamented with 4 fountains, each springing from a crystal basin and spreading out into a feathery spray that glistened like whirling snow in the dazzling white light. As Bulger and I directed our steps towards one of the benches with the intention of taking a good rest, a low growl from him warned me to be on the alert. I gave a second look. A human being was seated on the bench. Beside myself as I was, with curiosity to come face to face with this inhabitant of the underworld, the first we had met, I made a halt, determined to ascertain, if possible, whether he was quite harmless before accosting him. He was small in stature and clad entirely in black, a sort of loose, flowing robe, much like a Roman toga. His head was bare, and what I could see of it, it was round, smooth, and rosy, with about as much hair, or rather fuzz, upon it as the head of an infant 6 weeks old. His face was hidden by a black fan which he carried in his right hand, and the uses of which you will learn later on. His eyes were shielded from the intense glare of the light by a pair of colored glass goggles. As he raised his hand between me and the light, I couldn't help catching my breath. I could see right through it. The bones were as clear as amber. And his head, too, was only a little less opaque. Suddenly, 2 words from Don Fume's manuscript flashed through my mind, and I exclaimed joyously, "Bulger, we're in the land of the transparent folk." At the sound of my voice, the little man arose and made a low bow, lowering his fan to his breast where he held it. His baby face was ludicrously sad and solemn. "Yes, sir stranger," said he in a low, musical voice, "thou art indeed in the land of Mikaminnikis, Mikamin, in the land of transparent folk, called also Goggle Land. But if I should show thee my heart, thou wouldst see that I am deeply pained to think that I should have been the first to bid thee welcome. For know, sir stranger, that thou speakest with Master Cold Soul, the court depressor, the saddest man in all Goggle Land. And by the way, sir, permit me to offer thee a pair of goggles for thyself, and also a pair for thy 4-footed companion, for our intense white light would blind thee both in a few days." I thanked Master Cold Soul very warmly for the goggles, and proceeded to set one pair astride my nose, and to tie the other in front of Bulger's eyes, and then, in most courteous manner, informed Master Cold Soul who I was, and begged him to explain the cause of his great sadness. "Well, thou must know, little Baron," said he, after I had taken a seat beside him on the bench, "that we, the loving subjects of Queen Galaxa, whose royal heart is almost run down, excuse these tears, living as we do in this beautiful world so unlike the one you inhabit, which our wise men tell us is built, strange to say, on the very outside of the earth's crust, where it is most exposed to the full sweep of blinding snow, freezing blast, pelting hail, drowning rain, and choking dust, living as we do, I say, in this vast temple by nature's own hands builded, where disease is unknown, and where our hearts run down like clocks that may have but one winding. We are prone, alas, to be too happy, to laugh too much, to spend too much time in idle gaiety, chattering the time away like thoughtless children amused with baubles, delighted with tinsel nothings. Know then, little Baron, that mine is the business to check this gaiety, to put an end to this childish glee, to depress our people's spirits, lest they run too high. Hence my garb of inky hue, my rueful countenance, my frequent outflowing of tears, my voice ever attuned to sadness. Excuse me, little Baron, my fan slipped then. Didst see through me? I would not have thee see my heart today. For some way or other I cannot bring it to a slow pace. It is dreadfully unruly. I assured him that I had not seen through him as yet. And now, dear friends, I must explain that by the laws of the Micaminkis, each man, woman, and child must wear in their garments a heart-shaped opening on their breast, directly over their hearts, with a corresponding one at the back, so that under certain conditions, when the law allows it, each may have the right to take a look at his neighbor's heart and see exactly how it is beating, whether fast or slow, whether throbbing or leaping, or whether pulsating calmly and naturally. But this privilege is only accorded, as I have said, under certain conditions. Hence, to shut off inquisitive glances, each Mikaminki is allowed to carry a black fan with which to cover the heart-shaped opening above described, and in this way conceal his or her feelings to a degree. I say to a degree, for I may as well tell you right here that falsehood is unknown, or, more correctly stated, impossible in the land of the transparent folk, for the reason that so wondrously clear, limpid, and crystal-like are their eyes, that the slightest attempt to say one thing while they are thinking another roils and clouds them as if a drop of milk had fallen into a glass of the purest water. As I sat gazing at this strange little being seated on the bench there beside me, I recalled a conversation which I had had with a learned Russian at Solvychegodsk. He said, speaking of his people, "We are all born with light hair, brilliant eyes, and pale faces, for we have sprung up under the snow." And I thought to myself how delighted, how entranced he would have been to look upon this curious being, born not under the snow, but far under the surface of the earth, where in these vast chambers of this world within a world, this strange folk had, like plants, grown in a dark, deep cellar, gradually parted with all their coloring, until their eyes glowed like orbs of pure crystal, until their bones had been bleached to amber clearness, and their blood coursed colorless through colorless veins. While sitting there following out this train of thought, the clear white light suddenly began to flicker, and to play fantastic tricks upon the walls by dancing in garbs of ever-changing hues, now brightest yellow, now palest green, now glorious purple, and now deepest crimson. "Ah, little Baron," exclaimed Master Cold Soul, "that was an uncommonly short day. Rise, please." I made haste to obey, whereupon he touched a spring on the bench opened in the center, disclosing 2 very comfortable beds. "In a few moments night will be upon us," continued the Mikaminki, "but thou seest that we have not been taken by surprise. I should explain to thee, little Baron, that owing to the capricious manner in which our river of light is apt both to begin and to cease flowing, we are never able to tell how long a day or night will prove to be. This is what we call twilight. In thy world, day goes out with a terrible bang, for our wise men tell us that nothing can be done in the upper world without making a noise, and that your people really love noise, and that the man who makes the greatest noise is considered the greatest man. Owing to the fact, little Baron, that no one in Goggleland can tell how long the day will last, or how long it may be necessary to sleep, our laws permit no one to set any exact time when a thing shall be done, or to exact any promise to do this or that on a certain day, for, bless thy soul, that day may not be 10 minutes long. Hence we say, if tomorrow be over 5 hours long, come to me at the beginning of the 6th hour, and we never wish each other a plain good night, but say, good night as long as it lasts. What's more, little Baron, as night is apt to come upon us this way unawares, by law all the beds belong to the state. No one is allowed to own his own bed, for when night overtakes him he may be at the other end of the city, and some other subject of Queen Galaxa may be in front of his door, and no matter where night may overtake a Mikaminki, he is sure to find a bed. There are beds everywhere. By touching a spring they drop from the walls, they pull out like drawers. They're under the tables and divans, in the parks, in the marketplace, by the roadside, benches, bins, boxes, barrows and barrels, by pressing a spring, may in an instant be transformed into beds. It is the land of beds, little Baron. But, behold, the twilight goes to its end. Good night, as long as it lasts." And with this, Master Cold Soul stretched himself out and began to snore, having first carefully covered up the 2 holes in the front and back of his garment, so that I shouldn't have a chance to take a peep through him in case I should wake up first. Bulger and I were right glad to lay our limbs on a real bed, although from the way my 4-footed brother followed his tail around and around, I could see that he wasn't particularly delighted with the softness of the couch. Chapter 8. Good morning, as long as it lasts. Plain talk from Master Cold Soul. Wonders of Goggoland. We enter the city of the Minka-Minkies. Brief description of it. Our approach to the royal palace. Queen Galaxa and her crystal throne. Master Cold Soul's tears. I don't think the darkness lasted over 3 hours. Perhaps it was longer. But Master Cold Soul was obliged to shake me gently ere he could rouse me. "Now, little Baron," said he, after he had wished me a good morning with the usual "as long as it lasts" tack to it. "If thou art quite willing, I'll conduct thee to the court of our gracious mistress, Queen Galaxa. Our wise men have often discoursed to her concerning the upper world and the terrible sufferings of its people, exposed as they are to be first frozen by the pitiless cold, and then burned by the scorching rays of what they call their sun, and she will no doubt deign to be pleased at the sight of thee. Although I must warn thee that thou art most uncomely, that thou seemst so black and hard to me as scarcely to be human, but rather a bit of living earth or rock. I greatly fear me that thou wilt make our people extremely vain in comparison. Thy 4-footed companion we know well by sight. We often have seen his petrified image in the rocks of the dark chambers of our world." "Master Cold Soul," said I, as we walked along, "when thou gettest to know me better, thou wilt find me more comely. And although I shall not be able to show thee my heart, I hope to be able to prove to thee and thine that I have such a thing." No doubt, little Baron," exclaimed Master Cold Soul, "but be not offended. It is not more pleasant for me to tell thee these disagreeable things than it is for thee to hear them, but I am paid to do it, and I must earn my wage. Vanity grows apace in our world, and I prick its bubbles whenever I see them." To my great wonder, I now discovered that the world of the Minka-Minkies had its lakes and rivers like our own, only of course they were smaller and mirror-faced, being never visited by the faintest zephyr. To my question as to whether they were peopled with living things, Master Cold informed me that they literally swarmed with the most delicious fish, both in scales and shells. "But think not, little Baron," he added, "that we of Goggoland have no other food than such as we draw from the water, for in our gardens grow many kinds of delicate vegetables, springing up in a single night almost, as light as foam and just as white. But we are small eaters, little Baron, and rarely find it necessary to put to death a large shellfish. We merely lay hold of his great claw, which he obligingly drops into our hand, and forthwith sets about growing another." "But tell me, I pray thee, Master Cold Soul," said I, "where ye find the silk to weave such soft and beautiful stuff as that thy garment is fashioned from?" "In this underworld of ours, little Baron," replied Master Cold Soul, "there are many vast recesses not reached by the river of light, and in these dark chambers flit about huge night moths, like restless spirits forever on the wing. But of course they are not, for we find their eggs glued against the rocky sides of these caverns, and collect them carefully. The worms that are hatched from them spin huge cocoons so large that one may not be hidden in my hand, and these unwound give unto our looms all the thread they need." "And the beautiful wood," I continued, "which I see about me, carved and fashioned into so many articles, whence comes it?" "From the quarries," answered Master Cold Soul. "Quarries?" I repeated wonderingly. "Why, yes, little Baron," said he, For we have quarries of wood, as no doubt thou hast quarries of stone. Our wise men tell us that thousands and thousands of years ago, vast forests grown in your world were in the upheavals and fallings in of the earth's crust, thrust down into ours, the gigantic trunks wedged closely together, and standing bolt upright just as they grew. At least so we find them when we have dug away the hardened clay that has shut them in these many ages. But see, little baron, we are now entering the city. Yonder is the royal palace. Wilt walk with me thither? Ah, dear friends, would I that I could make you see this beautiful city of the underworld just as it showed itself to me then, spread out so gloriously beneath the glittering domes and vaulted corridors, from which poured down upon the exquisitely carved and polished entrances to the living chambers of this happy folk. A flood of white light, apparently more dazzling than our noonday sun. It was a sight so strangely beautiful that many times I paused to gaze upon it. Young and old, all clad in the same gracefully flowing garbs of silk, now purple, now royal blue, and now rich vermilion, were hurrying hither and thither, each armed with the inevitable black fan, and the baby face of each aglow with life and sweet content, while 100 fountains springing from crystal basins glistened in the dazzling white light, and 10 times 100 flags and gonfalons hung listless but rich in splendor from invisible wires. Strange music came floating along from the gracefully shaped barges with silken awnings, which were gliding noiselessly over the surface of the winding river, the oars stirring the waters until the wake seemed a path through molten silver. As Bulger and I followed Master Cold Soul along the streets of polished marble, it was not long before a crowd of Mikaminkies was at our heels, whispering all sorts of uncomplimentary things about us, mingled with not a few fits of suppressed laughter. The court depressor reproved them sternly. "Cease your ill-timed mirth," said he, "and go about your business. Must I pause and tell you a gruesome tale to check your foolish gaiety? Know ye not that all this silly mirth doth quicken your hearts and make them run down just so much sooner?" At these words of Master Cold Soul they fell back, and put an end to their giggling. But it was only for a moment, and by the time we reached the portal of the royal palace, a still louder and noisier crowd was close behind us. Master Cold Soul suddenly halted, and drawing forth a huge pocket handkerchief, began to weep furiously. It was not without its effect, and from that moment I could see that the Mikaminkies were inclined to make a more serious view of my arrival in their city, although it was only Cold Soul's presence that kept them from bursting out into fits of violent laughter. Above the portals of the Queen's palace there were large openings hewn in the rock for the purpose of admitting light into the royal apartments. But these windows, if they may be called such, were hung with silken curtains of delicate colors, so that the light which entered the throne room was tempered and softened. The room itself was likewise hung with silken stuffs, which gave it a look of oriental splendor. But never in my travels among strange peoples of faraway lands had my eyes ever rested upon any work of art that equaled the crystal throne upon which sat Galaxa, queen of the Mikaminkies. In the upper world, most diligent search had never been able to unearth a piece of rock crystal more than about 3 feet in diameter. But here, in Queen Galaxa's throne room, 4 glorious columns at least 15 feet in height, and at their base 3 feet in diameter, shot up in matchless splendor. Their lower parts shut in spangles of gold that glittered with ever-varying hues as a different light fell upon them. The cross pieces and pieces making up the back and arms had been chosen on account of the exquisitely beautiful hair and needle-shaped crystals of other metals which they enclosed. A silken baldachin of rare beauty covered in the throne, and from its edges dropped heavy cords and tassels of rich color, and the perfection of human handicraft as to fineness and finish. At the foot of the throne sat the young princess Crystallina, and standing behind her and engaged in combing her long silken tresses was her favorite waiting maid, Damosel Glowstone, while around and about in files and group-wise stood lords and ladies, courtiers and counselors by the dozen. As Master Coldsoul advanced to salute the queen, a throng of the idlers who had followed at our heels crowded into the anteroom with loud outbursts of laughter. The court depressor was greatly incensed, and turning upon the throng he began weeping again with wonderful energy. And I noticed that it was nothing but sound. Not a tear fell to obscure the crystal clearness of his eyes. Then he began chanting a sort of song which was intended to have a depressing influence on the wild mirth of the Mickaminkies. I can only recollect one verse of this solemn chant of the court depressor. It ran as follows. Weep, Mickaminkies, weep, oh weep, for the eyeless man in the city of light, for the mouthless man in plenty's bowers, for the earless man in music's realm, for the noseless man in the kingdom of flowers. Weep, Mickaminkies, weep, oh weep. But they only laughed the louder, crying out, Nay, Master Coldsoul, we will not weep for them thyself. At last Queen Galaxa raised the slender golden wand, tipped with a diamond point, that lay within her hand, and instantly a hush came upon the whole place, while every eye was riveted upon Bulger and me. Chapter 9. Bulger and I are presented to Queen Galaxa, the lady of the Crystal Throne. How she received us. Her delight over Bulger, who gives proof of his wonderful intelligence in many ways. How the Queen creates him Lord Bulger. All about the 3 wise men in whose care we are placed by Queen Galaxa. Owing to the soft air, the never-varying temperature, and the absence of all noise and dust, the Mickaminkies, although they hide in the end like other folk, yet do they never seem to grow old. Their skin remains soft and free from wrinkles, and their eyes as clear and bright as the crystal of Queen Galaxa's throne. At the time of our arrival in the land of transparent folk, Queen Galaxa's heart had almost run down. In about 2 weeks more, it would come quietly and gently to a stop. For as I have already told you, dear friends, the heart of the Mickaminki being perfectly visible when the dazzling white light in its full strength was allowed to shine through his body, why, it was a very easy matter for a physician to take a look at the organ of life, and tell almost to the hour when it would exhaust itself, in other words, run down. Galaxa looked every inch a real queen as she half reclined upon her glorious crystal throne. She was clad in long, flowing silk garments of a right royal purple, and the gems which encircled her neck and wrists would have put to shame the crown jewels of any monarch of the upper world. Her garb had very much the cut and style of the ancient Greek costume, and the gold sandals worn by her added to the resemblance. But the one thing that excited my wonder more than all the others put together was her hair. So long, so fine and silken was it. Such a mass of it was there, and so dazzling white was it. Not the blue or yellow white that comes of age in our world, but a milk white, a cotton white. And as we drew near, to Bulger's, but not to my amazement, her hair began to quiver and rustle and rise, until it buried her whole throne completely out of sight. Of course I knew that, seated as she was upon a throne of glass, it was only necessary to send a gentle current of electricity through her to make her wonderful head of hair stand up in this manner, like the white and filmy tentacles of some gigantic creature of the sea, half plant, half animal. "Rise, little baron," said Queen Galaxa, as I dropped upon my right knee on the lowest step of the throne, "and be welcome to our kingdom. Whilst thou may be pleased to tarry here, my people shall bestir themselves to show thee all that may seem wonderful in thine eyes. For although our wise men have often discussed to us of the upper world, yet art thou its first inhabitant to visit us, and thy wonderful companion is right welcome too. Can he talk, little baron?" "Not exactly, Queen Galaxa," said I with low obeisance, yet he can understand me and I him. He is quite harmless, is he not? Asked the queen. You may try to imagine how I felt, dear friends, when I was about to say, perfectly so, royal lady. To my amazement, I saw Bulger advance and sniff at the Princess Crystallina, and then draw back and show his teeth as she stretched out her hand to caress him. Bending over him, I reproved him in a whisper, and made him kneel before the queen. This he proceeded to do, saluting her with 3 very stately bows, at which everybody laughed heartily. I would have him come nearer, said the queen, so that I may lay my hand upon him. At a sign from me, Bulger began to lick his forepaws very carefully, and then, having wiped them on the rug, sprang up the steps of the throne and placed his front feet upon Queen Galaxa's lap. The fair ruler of the Micaminkis was delighted with this sample of Bulger's fine manners, and in order to amuse her still further, I proceeded to put Bulger through many of his quaint tricks and curious feats, bidding him say his prayers, feign death, weep for his sweetheart, count 10, walk upright, go lame and cry to tell how it hurts. Scarcely had he gone half around the circle, feigning lameness, when the damosel Glowstone began to weep herself, and stooping down commenced to caress Bulger and to kiss his lame foot, caresses which, to my more than surprise, Bulger was not slow in returning, and later too, when I bade him choose the maiden he loved best and kissed her hand, he bounded straight toward Glowstone and bestowed not 1 but 20 kisses upon her outstretched hands, while the Princess Crystallina shrank away in fear and disgust from the ugly beast, as she termed him. Bid him bring my handkerchief to me, little baron, cried Galaxa, throwing it on the floor. I did as the queen commanded, but Bulger refused to obey. Thou seest, Queen Galaxa, said I with a low bow, he refuses to lift the handkerchief without a command from thy royal self. Which delicate compliment pleased the lady mightily. How comes it, little baron, she asked, that thou shouldst be of noble lineage, and thy brother, as thou callest him, plain Bulger? It comes, royal lady, said I right humbly, as it often comes in the world which I inhabit, that honors go to them that least deserve them. Well then, little baron, cried Galaxa gaily, though I be but a petty sovereign compared with thine, yet may small rulers do acts of great justice. Bid thy 4-footed brother kneel before us. At a word from me, Bulger prostrated himself on the steps of Galaxa's crystal throne and laid his head at her very feet. Leaning forward, she touched him slightly with her golden wand and exclaimed, Rise, Lord Bulger, rise. Queen Galaxa, seated on her crystal throne, bids Lord Bulger rise. In an instant, Bulger raised himself on his hind feet and laid his head in the queen's lap, while the whole room rang with loud huzzas, and every lady gently clapped her frail and glass-like hands, save the Princess Crystallina, who feigned to be asleep. Queen Galaxa now undid a string of pearls from her neck and tied them with her own hands around Lord Bulger's, and so it was that my 4-footed brother ceased to be plain Bulger. Then, turning to her counselors of state, Queen Galaxa bid them assign a royal apartment to Lord Bulger and me, and gave strict orders that the severest punishment be at once visited upon any Mikaminki who should dare laugh at us, or to make disrespectful remarks concerning our dark eyes and skins and weather-beaten appearance. For as the royal lady said to her people, Ye might look worse than they were ye compelled to live on the outside instead of the inside of the world, exposed to biting blasts, piercing cold, and clouds of suffocating dust. By the queen's orders, 3 of the wisest of the Mikaminkis were selected to attend Bulger and me, look after our wants, explain everything to us. In a word, do all in their power to make our stay in Goggleland as pleasant as possible. Their names, as nearly as I can translate them, were Dr. Nebulosus, Sir Amber Opaque, and Lord Cornicure. I should explain to you, dear friends, the meanings of these names, for you might be inclined to think that Dr. Somewhat Cloudy, Sir Clear as Amber, and Lord Heart of Horn might indicate that they were more or less muddled in their intellects. Far from it. I have already stated to you that they were 3 of the very wisest men in the land of the transparent folk, and the lack of clearness indicated by their names had reference solely to their eyes. Now, as you know, the learned men of our upper world have a different look from ordinary folk. They are stoop-shouldered, shaggy-eyebrowed, long-haired, pursed-lipped, nearsighted, shambling-gaited. Well, the only effect that long years of deep study had upon the Minkaminkies was to rob their beautiful crystal-like eyes of more or less of their clearness. Now I think you'll understand why these 3 learned Minkaminkies were named as they were. At any rate, they were, in spite of their strange names, 3 most charming gentlemen, and no matter how many times I might ask the same question over again, they were always ready with an answer quite as polite as the one first given me. They did everything that I had a right possibly to expect them to do. Indeed, there was but one single thing which I would have fain had them do, and that was to let me look through them. This they most carefully avoided doing, and no matter how warmed up they might become in their descriptions, and no matter how on the alert I was to catch the coveted peep, the inevitable black fan was always in the way. Naturally, not only they, but all the transparent folk felt a repugnance to have a perfect stranger look through them, and I couldn't blame them for it either. I despaired of ever getting a chance of seeing a human heart beating away for dear life, for all the world just like the swing of a pendulum or the vibration of a balance wheel. Chapter 10. A brief account of my conversations with Dr. Nebulosus, Sir Amber Opaque, and Lord Cornacure, who tell me many things that I never knew before, for which I was very grateful. Lord Bulger and I were more than pleased with our new friends, Dr. Nebulosus, Sir Amber Opaque, and Lord Cornacure. Although so eager were they to make us thoroughly comfortable, that they overdid the matter at times and left me scarcely a moment to myself in which to make an entry in my notebook. They were extremely solicitous lest in my ignorance I should set down something wrong about them. For, said Sir Amber Opaque, now that thou hast found the way to this underworld of ours, little baron, I feel assured that we shall have a number of visitors from thy people every year or so, and I have already issued orders to have extra beds made as soon as the wood can be quarried. Dr. Nebulosus gave me a very interesting account of the various ailments which the Minkaminkies suffer from. All sickness among our people, little baron, said he, is purely mental or emotional, that is, of the mind or feelings. There is no thing as bodily infirmity among us. Wine and strong drink are unknown in our world, and the food we eat is light and easily digested. We are never exposed to the danger of breathing a dust-laden atmosphere, and while we are an active and industrious people, yet we sleep a great deal. For as our laws forbid the use of lamps or torches, except for the use of those toiling in the dark chambers, it is not possible for us to ruin our health by turning night into day. We go to bed the very moment the river of light ceases to flow. The only ailment that ever gives me the least trouble is Iburia frosnea. Pray, what is the nature of that element? I asked. It is an inclination to be too happy, replied Dr. Nebulosus gravely, and I regret to say that several of our people attacked with this ailment have shortened their lives by refusing to take my remedies. It usually develops very slowly, beginning with an inclination to giggle, which after a while is succeeded by violent fits of laughter. For instance, little baron, when thou camest among us, many of our people were attacked with a violent form of Iburia frosnea, and although Master Coldsoul, the court depressor, made great efforts to check it, yet he was quite powerless to do so. It spread over the city with remarkable rapidity. Without knowing why, our workmen at their work, our children at their play, our people indoors and out began to laugh and to be dangerously happy. I made examinations of several of the worst cases, and discovered that at the rate they were beating the hearts, the most of them would run down in a single week. It was terrible. A council was hastily held, and it was determined to conceal thee and Lord Bulger from public view, but happily my skill got the upper hand of the attack. Didst increase the number of pills to be taken? I asked. No, little baron, said Dr. Nebulosus. I increased their size and covered them with a dry powder, which make them extremely difficult to swallow, and in this way compelled those taking them to cease their laughing. But there were a number of cases so violent that they could not be cured in this way. Those I ordered to be strapped in at the waist with broad belts, and to have their mouths held pried open with wooden wedges. As thou mayest understand, this made laughing so difficult that they speedily gave up altogether. Ah, little baron, continued the wise doctor with a sigh, that was a sorry day for the human race when it learned how to laugh. It is my opinion that we owe this useless agitation of our bodies to you people of the upper world. Exposed as ye were to piercing winds and biting frosts, ye contracted the habit of shivering to keep warm, and little by little this shivering habit so grew upon you, that ye kept up the shivering, whether ye were cold or not, only you called it by another name. Now my knowledge of the human body teaches me that this quivering of the flesh is a very wise provision of nature, to keep the blood in motion, and in this way to save the human body from perishing from the cold. But why should we shiver when we are happy, little baron? All pleasure is the thought, and yet at the very moment when we should keep our bodies in as perfect repose as possible, we begin this ridiculous shivering. Do we shiver when we look upon the beauties of the river of light, or listen to sweet music, or gaze upon the loving countenance of our gracious Queen Galaxa? But worse than all, little baron, this senseless quivering and shivering which we call laughter, unlike good, deep, long-drawn, wholesome sighs, empty the lungs of air without filling them again, and thus do we often see these gigglers and laughers fall over in fainting fits, absolutely choked by their own wild and unreasoning action. I have always contended, little baron, that we alone of all animals had the laughing habit, and I am now delighted to have my opinion confirmed by my acquaintance with the wise and dignified Lord Bulger. Observe him. He knows quite as well as we what it is to be pleased, to be amused, to be delighted, but he doesn't think it necessary to have recourse to fits of shivering and shuddering. Through the brightened-eyed true window of the soul, I can see how happy he is. I can measure his joy. I can take note of his contentment. I was delighted with this learned discourse of the gentle Dr. Nebulosus, and made notes of it, lest the points of his argument might escape my memory. The more pleased was I in that he proved my faithful Bulger to be so wisely constructed and regulated by nature. I made particular inquiry of my friends Sir Amber Opaque and Lord Cornicure, as to whether Queen Galaxa ever had any trouble in governing her people. None whatever, was the answer. In many a long year has it only been necessary on 1 or 2 occasions to summon a Mickaminky before the magistrate and examine his heart under a strong light. The only punishment allowed by our laws is confinement for a shorter or longer time in one of the dark chambers. The severest sentence ever known to have been passed by one of our magistrates was 12 hours in length. But in all honesty, we must admit, little baron, that falsehood and deception are unknown amongst us for the simple reason that, being transparent, it is almost impossible for a Mickaminky to deceive a brother without being caught in the act. Therefore, why make the attempt? The very moment one of us begins to say one thing while he is thinking another, his eyes cloud up and betray him, just as the crystal-clear weather glass clouds up at the approach of a storm in the upper world. But this, of course, little baron, is only true of our thoughts. Our laws allow us to hide our feelings by the use of the black fan. No one may look upon another's heart unless its owner wills it. It is a very grave offense for one Mickaminky to look through another without that one's permission. But as thou wilt readily understand, inasmuch as we are by nature transparent, it is utterly impossible for a marriage to prove an unhappy one, for the reason that when a youth declares his love for a maiden, they both have the right by law to look upon each other's hearts, and in this way they can tell exactly the strength of the love that they have for each other. This and many other strange and interesting things did my new friends, Dr. Nebulosus, Sir Amber Opaque, and Lord Cornicure, impart unto me, and right grateful was I to good Queen Galaxa for having chosen them for me. Good friends are better than gold, although we may not think it at the time. Chapter 11. Pleasant days passed among the Mickamingis, and wonderful things seen by us. The spectral garden, and a description of it. Our meeting with Damozel Glowstone and what came of it. From now on, Lord Bulger and I made ourselves perfectly at home among the Mickamingis. One of the royal barges was placed at our disposal, and when we grew tired of walking about and gazing at the wonders of this beautiful city of the underworld, we stepped aboard our barge and were rowed hither and thither on the glassy river. And if I had not seen it myself, I never would have believed that any kind of shellfish could ever be taught to be so obliging as to swim to the surface and offer one of their huge claws for our dinner, politely dropping it into our hand the moment we laid hold of it. On one of the river banks, I noticed a long row of wooden compartments, looking very much like a grocer's bins. But you may think how amused Bulger and I were upon coming closer to this long row of little houses to find that they were turtle nests, and that quite a number of the turtles were sitting comfortably in their nests, busy laying their eggs, which, let me assure you, were the most dainty tidbits I ever tasted. I think I informed you that the river flowing through Goggle Land was fairly swarming with delicious fish, the carp and sole being particularly delicate in flavor. And knowing, as I did, what a tender-hearted folk the Minkaminkis are, I had not been a little puzzled in my mind as to how they had ever been able to summon up courage enough to drive a spear into one of these little fish, which were as tame and playful as a lot of kittens or puppies, and followed our barge hither and thither, snapping up the food we tossed to them, and leaping into the air where they glistened like burnished silver as the white light sparkled on their scales. But the mystery was solved one day when I saw one of the fishermen decoying a score or more of fish into a sort of pen shut off from the river by a wire netting. Scarcely had he closed the gates when, to my amazement, I saw the fish, one after the other, come to the surface and float about on their sides, stone dead. "This, little baron," explained the man in charge, "is the death chamber. Hidden at the bottom of this dark pool lie several electric eels of great size and power, and when our people want a fresh supper of fish, we simply open these gates and decoy a shoal of them inside by tossing their favorite food into the water. The executioners are awaiting them, and in a few instants, the fish, while enjoying their repast and suspecting no harm, are painlessly put to death, as thou hast seen." One part of the city of the transparent folk which attracted Bulger and me very much was the royal gardens. It was a weird and uncanny place, and upon my first visit I walked through its paths and beneath its arbors, upon my toes and with bated breath, as you might steal into some bit of fairyland, looking anxiously from side to side as if every step you expected some sprite or goblin to trip you up with a tough spiderweb, or brush your cheeks with their cold and satiny wings. Now, dear friends, you must first be told that with the loss of sunshine and the open air, the flowers and shrubs and vines of this underground world gradually parted with their perfumes and colors, their leaves and petals and stems and tendrils, growing paler and paler in hue, like lovelorn maids whose sweethearts had never come back from the war. Month by month, the dark greens, the blush pinks, the golden yellows, and the deep blues pined away, longing for the lost sunshine and the wooing breeze they loved so dearly, until at last the transformation was complete, and there they all stood or hung bleached to utter whiteness, like those fantastic clumps of flowers and wreaths of vines which the feathery snow of April builds in the leafless shrubs and trees. I cannot tell you, dear friends, what a strange feeling came over me as I stepped within this spectral garden where ghost-like vines clung in fantastic forms and figures to the dark trellises, and where tall lilies, whiter than the down of eider, stood bolt upright like spirits doomed to eternal silence, denied even the speech of perfume, and where huge clusters of snowy chrysanthemums, fluffy, feathery forms, seemed pressing their soft bodies together like groups of banished celestials in a sort of silent despair as they felt the warmth and glow of sunlight slowly and gradually quitting their souls. Where lower down great roses with snowy petals whiter than the seashells hung motionless, bursting open with eager effort, as if listening for some signal that would dissolve the spell put upon them and give them back the sunshine, and with it their color and their perfume. Where lower still beds of violets, bleached white as fleecy clouds, seemed wrapped in silent sorrow at loss of the heavenly perfume which had been theirs on earth. Where above the lilies' heads shot long, slender, spectral stalks of sunflowers, almost invisible, loaded at their ends with clusters of snowy flowers, thus suspended like white faces, looking down through the silent air and waiting for the sunshine that never came. And higher still, all over, and above these spectral flowers, entwining and enwrapping and falling festoon and garland-wise, crept and ran like unto long lines of escaping phantoms, ghostly vines with ghostly blossoms, bent and twisted and wrapped and coiled into 1,000 strange and fantastic forms and figures, which the white light with its inky shadows made alive and half-human, so that movement and voice alone were needful to make this garden seem peopled with sorrowing sprites banished to these subterranean chambers, for strange misdeeds done on earth and condemned to wait 10,000 years ere sunlight and their color and their perfume should be given back to them again. While strolling through the royal gardens one day, Bulger suddenly gave a low cry and bounded on ahead, as if his eyes had fallen upon the familiar form of some dear friend. When I came up with him, he was crouching beside the Damoiselle Glowstone, who, seated on one of the garden benches, was caressing Bulger's head and ears with one of her soft hands, with its filmy-like skin, while the other held its black fan pressed tightly against her bosom. She looked up at me with her crystal eyes and smiled faintly as I drew near. "Thou seest, little Baron," she murmured, "Lord Bulger and I have not forgotten each other. Since our presentation at court, I had been going through and through my mind in search of some reason for Bulger's sudden affection for Damoiselle Glowstone, but had found none. I was the more perplexed as she was but the maid of honor, while the fair Princess Crystallina sat on the very steps of the throne. But I said nothing save to reply that I was greatly pleased to see it, and to add that where Bulger's love went, mine was sure to follow. "Oh, little Baron, if I could but believe that," sighed the fair damoiselle. "Thou mayst," said I. "Indeed thou mayst." "Then, if I may, little Baron," she replied, "I will, and prithee thee, come and sit beside me here, only till I bid thee, look not through me. Dost promise?" "I do, fair damoiselle," was my answer. "And thou, Lord Bulger, lie there at my feet," she continued, "and keep thy wise eyes fixed upon me and thy keen ears wide open. Little Baron, if both thine and our worlds were filled with sorrowing hearts, mine would be the heaviest of them all. List, oh list to the sad, sad tale of the sorrowing maid with the speck in her heart, and when thou knowest all, give me of thy wisdom." Chapter 12. The sad, sad tale of the sorrowing princess with a speck in her heart, and what all happened when she had ended it, which the reader must read for himself if he would know. "Little Baron and dear Lord Bulger," began the crystal-eyed damoiselle, after she had eased her soul of its load of woe by 3 long and deep, deep sighs. Know then that I am not the damosel Glowstone, but none other than the royal princess Crystallina herself. That she whose hair I comb should comb mine, that she whom I have served for 10 long years should have served me. And to think, O princess, I burst out joyfully, that my beloved Bulger should have been the first to discover that she who was seated on the steps of the crystal throne was not entitled to the seat. To think that his subtle intellect should have been the first to scent out the wrong that had been done thee, his keen eye the first to go to the bottom of truth's well. But, fair princess, I am bursting with impatience to know how thou thyself didst ever discover the wrong that has been done thee. That thou shalt speedily know, little baron, answered Crystallina, and that thou mayest know all that I know, I'll begin at the very beginning. The day I was born, there was great rejoicing in the land of the Micaminkis, and the people gathered in front of the royal palace and laughed and cried by turns. So happy were they to think that they were to be governed by another princess after Queen Galaxa's heart should run down. For many years ago, a bad king had made them very unhappy, and they had hoped and prayed that no more such would come to reign over them. And pretty soon one of them began to tell the others what he thought the little princess would be like. She will be the fairest that ever sat upon the crystal throne. Her hands and feet will be like pearls tipped with coral, her hair whiter than the river's foam, and from her beautiful eyes will burst the radiance of her pure soul, and her heart, oh, her heart, will be like a little lump of frozen water, so clear and so transparent will it be, so like a bit of purest crystal, bright and flawless as a diamond of the first water. And therefore, let her be called the Princess Crystallina, or the Maid with the Crystal Heart. Forthwith the cry went up, "Aye, let her be called Crystallina, or the Maid with the Crystal Heart." And Queen Galaxa heard the cry of her people, and sent them word that it should be as they wished, that I should be the Princess Crystallina. But, ah me, that I should have lived to tell it. After a few days the nurse came to my royal mother, wringing her hands and pouring down a flood of tears. Throwing herself on her knees, she whispered to the queen, "Royal mistress, bid me die rather than tell thee what I know." Being ordered to speak, the nurse informed Queen Galaxa that she had that day, for the first time, held me up to the light, and had discovered that there was a speck in my heart. The queen uttered a cry of horror and swooned. When she came to herself, she directed that I should be brought to her and held up to the light, so that she may see for herself. Alas, too true. There was the speck in my heart sure enough. I was not worthy of the sweet name which her loving people had bestowed upon me. They would turn from me with horror. They would never consent to have me for their queen when the truth should become known. They would not be moved by a mother's prayers. They would turn a deaf ear to everyone who should be bold enough to advise them to accept a princess with a speck in her heart, when they had thought they were getting one well deserving of the title they had bestowed upon her. Queen Galaxa knew that something must be done at once, that it would be time and labor lost to attempt to reason with disappointed people, so she set to work thinking up some way out of her trouble. Now it so happened, little baron, that the very day I had come into the world, a babe had been born to one of Queen Galaxa's serving women. And so, hastily summoning the woman, she ordered her to bring her babe into the royal bedchamber and leave it there, promising that it should be brought up as my foster sister. But no sooner had the serving woman gone her way rejoicing than the nurse was ordered to change the children in the cradle. And in a few moments, Glowstone was wrapped in my richly embroidered blanket, and I swathed up in her plain coverlets. How things went for several years I know not, but one day, how well I recollect it, my little mind was puzzled by hearing Crystallina cry out, "Nay, nay, dear mamma, 'tis not fair, I like it not. Each day when thou comest to us, thou givest Glowstone 10 kisses, and me but a single one." Then would Queen Galaxa smile a sad smile, and bestow some bauble upon Crystallina to coax her back to contentment again. And so we went on, Crystalina and I, from one year to another until we were little maids well grown, and she sat on the throne and wore royal purple stitched with gold, and I plain white. But still most of the kisses fell to my share, and I marveled not a little at it, but dared not ask why it was. However, once when I was alone with Queen Galaxa, seated on my cushion in the corner, plying my needle and thinking of the sail we were to have on the river that day, suddenly I was startled to see the Queen throw herself on her knees in front of me, and to feel her clasp me in her arms and cover my face and head with tears and kisses, as she sobbed and moaned, "Oh, my babe, my lost babe, my blessing and my joy, wilt never, never, never come back to me? Art gone forever? Must I give thee up? Oh, must I?" "Nay, royal lady," I stammered in my more than wonder at her words and actions. "Thou art in a dream. Awake and see clearly. I am not Crystalina. I am Glowstone, thy foster child. I'll hie me straight and bring my royal sister to thee." But she will not let me loose, and for all answer showered more kisses on me, till I was well nigh smothered. So tight she held me pressed against her bosom, while around and over me her long, thick tresses fell like a woven mantle. And then she told me all that I have told thee, little baron, and charged me never to impart it unto any soul in Goggleland, and I made a solemn promise unto her that I never would. "And thou hast kept thy word like a true princess as thou art," said I cheerily, "for I am not of thy world, fair Crystalina." "Now that I have told thee the sad tale of the sorrowing princess with the speck in her heart, little baron," murmured Crystalina, fixing her large and radiant eyes upon me, "there is but one thing more for me to do, and it is to let thee look through me, so that thou mayest know exactly what counsel to give." And so saying, the fair princess rose from her seat, and having placed herself in front of me with a flood of white light falling full upon her back, she lowered her black fan, and bade me gaze upon the heavy heart which she had carried about with her all these years, and tell her exactly how large the speck was and where it lay, and what color it was. I was overjoyed to get an opportunity at last to look through one of the Mikaminkies, and my own heart bounded with satisfaction as I looked and looked upon that mysterious little thing, nay, rather a tiny being, living, breathing, palpitating within her breast, now slow and measured as she dwelt in thought upon her sad fate, now beating faster and faster as the hope bubbled up in her mind that possibly I might be able to counsel her so wisely that an end would come to all her sorrow. "Well, wise little baron," she murmured anxiously, "what seest thou? Is it very large? And what part is it? Is it black as night, or some color less fatal?" "Take courage, fair princess," said I. "It is very small, and lies just beneath the bow on the left side. Nor is it black, but reddish rather, as if a single drop of blood from the veins of thy far distant ancestors had outlived them these thousands of years, and hardened there to tell whence thy people came." The princess wept tears of joy upon hearing these comforting words. "If it had been black," she whispered, "I would have lain me down in this bed of violets and never risen more till my people had come to bear me to my grave in the silent burial chamber, unvisited by the river of light." At this sad outbreak, Bulger whined piteously and licked the princess's hands, as he looked up at her with his dark eyes radiant with sympathy. She was greatly cheered by this message of comfort, and it moved me too by its heartiness. "List, fair princess," said I gravely. "I own the task is not a light one, but hope for the best. I would that we had more time, but as thou knowest, Queen Galaxa's heart will soon run down. Therefore we must act with dispatch as well as wisdom. But first of all, must I speak with the Queen and gain her consent to act for thee in this matter?" "That, I fear, she will never grant," moaned Crystalina. "However, thou art so much wiser than I. Do as best seems to thee." The next thing to be done, fair princess, I added solemnly, is to show thy heart boldly and fearlessly to thy people. Nay, little baron, she exclaimed, rising to her feet, that may not be, that may not be. For know that our law doth make it treason itself for one of our people to look through a person of royal blood. Oh no, little baron, that may never be. Stay, sweet princess, I urged in gentlest tones, not so fast. Thou dost not know what I mean by showing thy heart boldly to thy people. Never fear. I will not break the law of the land, and yet they shall look upon the speck within thy heart, and see how small it is, and hear what I have to say about it, and thou shalt not even be visible to them. Oh, little baron, murmured Crystallina, if this may only be, I feel they will forgive me. Thou art so wise, and thy words carry such strong hope to my poor, heavy heart that I almost— Nay, fair princess, I interrupted, hope for the best, no more. I am not wise enough to read the future, and from what I know of thy people, they seem but little different from mine own. Perchance I may be able to sway them toward my views, and make them cry, Long live Princess Crystallina! But I can only promise thee to do my best. Betake thee now to the palace, and scorn not for yet a day or so to take up the golden comb, and play the damozel glowstone in all humility. Chapter 13. How I set to work to undo a wrong that had been done in the kingdom of the Micaminkis, and how Bulger helped. Queen Galaxa's confession. I am created Prime Minister as long as she lives. What took place in the throne room? My speech to the men of Goggle Land, after which I show them something worth seeing. How I was pulled in 2 different directions and what came of it. The first thing I did after the genuine Princess Crystallina had left me was to seek out Dr. Nebulosus and learn from him the exact number of hours before the Queen's heart would run down. As he had just been making an examination, he was able to tell the very minute. It was 17 hours and 13 minutes. Rather a short time, you must confess, my dear friends, in which to accomplish such an important piece of business as I had in mind. I then made my way directly to the royal palace and demanded a private audience with the Lady of the Crystal Throne. With the advice of Sir Amber O'Pake and Lord Cornicure, she firmly but graciously refused to receive me, giving as an excuse that the excitement would be sure to follow an interview with the Man of Coal, so the Micaminkis had named me, would shorten her life at least 13 minutes. But I was not to be put off in so unceremonious a manner. Sitting down, I seized a pen and wrote the following words upon a piece of glazed silk. To Galaxa, Queen of the Micaminkis, Lady of the Crystal Throne. I, Lord Bulger, a Micaminkian noble, bearer of this, who was the first to discover that the real princess was not sitting on the steps of the Crystal Throne, demand an audience from my master Baron Sebastian von Troomp, commonly known as Little Baron Troomp. And prompted by him, I ask, what are 13 minutes of thy life, O Queen Galaxa, to the long years of sorrow and disappointment in store for thy royal child? Taking this letter in his mouth, Bulger sprang away with long and rapid bounds. In a few minutes, he was in the presence of the Queen, for the guards had fallen back affrighted as they saw him draw near with his dark eyes flashing indignation. Raising himself upon his hind feet, he laid the letter in Galaxa's hands. The next moment she read it, she fell into a swoon, and all was stir and commotion in and round about the palace. I was hastily summoned, and the audience chamber cleared of every attendant save Dr. Nebulosus, Sir Amber O'Pake, Lord Cornicure, Lord Bulger, and me. Send for the damozel glowstone, commanded the Queen. And when she had appeared, to the amazement of all, saving Bulger and me, Galaxa bade her mount the steps of the Crystal Throne. Then, having embraced her most tenderly, the Queen spoke these words. O faithful counselors and wise friends from the upper world, this is the real Princess Crystallina, whom I have for all these years wickedly and wrongfully kept from her high state and royal privileges. She was born with a speck in her heart, and I feared that it would be useless to ask my people to accept her as my successor. "Aye, Lady of the Crystal Throne," exclaimed Lord Cornicure, "thou hast wisely done. Thy people would never have received her as Princess Crystallina. For, being by the laws of our land denied the privilege to look for themselves, they never would have believed that this spot in the princess's heart was but a tiny speck like a single hair crystal in the arm of thy magnificent throne. Therefore, O Queen, we counsel thee not to embitter thy last hours by differences with thy loving subjects." "My Lord Cornicure," said I with a low bow, "I make bold to raise my voice against thine, and I crave permission from Queen Galaxa to parley with her people." "Forbid it, royal lady," cried Sir Amber O'Pake savagely, at which Bulger gave a low growl and showed his teeth. "Queen Galaxa," I added gravely, "a wrong confessed is half redressed. This fair princess, 'tis true, hath a speck in her heart, which ill accords with the name bestowed upon her by thy people. Bid me be master until thy heart runs down, and by knighthood of all the Troomps I promise thee that thou shalt have 3 hours of happiness ere thy royal heart has ceased to beat." "Be it so, little baron," exclaimed Galaxa joyfully. "I proclaim thee prime minister for the rest of my life." At these words, Bulger broke out into a series of glad barks, and raising upon his hind legs, licked the queen's hand in token of his gratitude, while the fair princess looked a love at me that was too deep to put into words. I had now but a few hours to act. The excitement, so Dr. Nebulosus assured me, would shorten the queen's life a full hour. It had always been my custom to carry about with me a small but excellent magnifying glass, a double convex lens for the purpose of making examinations of minute objects, and also for reading inscriptions too fine to be seen with the naked eye. Hastily summoning a skillful metalworker, I instructed him to set the lens in a short tube and to enclose that tube within another, so that I could lengthen it at my pleasure. Then, having called together as many of the head men of the nation as the throne room would hold, I requested Lord Cornicure to inform them of the confession which Queen Galaxa had made, namely, that in reality Damoiselle Glowstone was Princess Crystallina, and Princess Crystallina was Damoiselle Glowstone. They were stricken speechless by this piece of information. But when Lord Cornicure went on to tell the whole story and to explain to them why the queen had practiced this deception upon them, they broke out into the wildest lamentation, repeating over and over again in piteous tones, "A speck in her heart! Oh, a speck in her heart! Oh, dire misfortune! Oh, woeful day! She can never be our princess if she hath a speck in her heart." By this time my arrangements were complete. I had placed the Princess Crystallina just outside the door of the throne room, where she stood concealed behind the thick hangings, and near her I had stationed Dr. Nebulosus with a large circular mirror of burnished silver in his hand. Calling out in a loud voice for silence, I thus addressed the weeping subjects of Queen Galaxa. "Oh, Mickaminkies, men of Goggle Land, transparent folk, I count myself most happy to be among you at this hour, and to be permitted by your gracious queen to raise my voice in defense of the unfortunate princess with the speck in her heart. Being of noble birth and an inhabitant of another world, it was lawful for me to look through the sorrowing princess, and I have done it. Yes, Minkaminkies, I have gazed upon her heart. I have seen the speck within it. Give ear, men of Goggleland, and you shall know how that speck came there. For it is not, as you doubtless think, a coal-black spot within that fair enclosure, clearer than the columns of Galaxa's throne. Oh no, Mickaminkies, 1,000 times no. It is a tiny blemish of reddish hue, a drop of princely blood from the upper world which I inhabit, and this drop in all these countless centuries has coursed through the veins of 1,000 kings, and still kept its roseate glow. Still remembered the glorious sunshine which called it into being. And now, men of Goggleland, lest you think that for some dark purpose of mine own I speak other than the pure and sober truth, behold, I show you the fair Crystallina's heart, in its very life and being as it is, beating and throbbing with hope and fear commingled. Look and judge for yourselves. And with this, I signaled to those on the outside of the palace to carry out my instructions. In an instant, the thick curtains were drawn and the throne room was wrapped in darkness. And at the same moment, Dr. Nebulosus, with his mirror, caught the strong white rays of light and threw them upon Crystallina's body, while I, through an opening in the hangings, made haste to apply the tube to which the lens had been fitted, and catching the reflected image of her heart, threw it up in plain and startling view upon the opposite wall of the throne room. Upon seeing how small the speck was, and how truthfully I had described it, the Micaminkis fell a-weeping for purest joy. And then, as if with one voice, they burst out, "Long live the fair Princess Crystallina with the ruby speck in her heart, and 10,000 blessings on the head of little Baron Troomp and Lord Bulger from saving our land from cruel dissensions." The people on the outside took up the cry, and in a few moments the whole city was thronged with bands of Queen Galaxa's subjects, singing and dancing and telling of their love for the fair princess with the ruby speck in her heart. I had kept my word. Queen Galaxa would have at least 3 hours of complete happiness ere her heart ran down. But suddenly, the river of light began to flicker and dim its flood of brilliant white rays. Night was coming, noiselessly, as if by magic. The Micaminkis faded from my sight, stealing away in search of beds, and as the gloom crept into the great throne room, someone plucked me gently by the hand, and a soft voice whispered, I love thee. Oh, who other than I can tell how I love thee?" And then a grip stronger than that gentle hand seized me by the skirt of my coat and dragged me away slowly, but surely away, through the darkness, through the gloom, out into the silent streets, ever away until at last that soft voice, choking with a sob, ceased its pleading and gasped, "Farewell, oh, farewell, I dare go no farther." And so Bulger, in his wisdom, led me on and ever out of the city of the Micaminkis, out upon the marble highway. Chapter 14. Bulger and I turn our backs on the fair domain of Queen Crystallina. Nature's wonderful speaking tube. Crystallina's attempt to turn us back. How I kept Bulger from yielding. Some incidents of our journey along the marble highway, and how we came to the glorious gateway of solid silver. Me, the sorrowing Sebastian, loaded with as heavy a heart as ever a mortal of my size had borne away with him, did the wise Bulger lead along the broad and silent highway, farther and yet farther from the city of the Micaminkis, until at last the music of the fountains, pattering in their crystal basins, died away in the distance and darkness behind me. I felt that my wise little brother was right, and so I followed on after, with not a sigh or a syllable to stay him. But he halted at last, and as I felt about me, I discovered that I was standing beside one of the richly carved seats that one so often meets with along the marble highway. I was quite as foot-weary as I was heart-heavy, and reaching out, I touched the spring which I knew would transform the seat into a bed, and clambering upon it, with my wise Bulger nestled beside me, I soon fell into a deep and refreshing sleep. When I awoke and, sitting up, looked back toward Queen Crystallina's capital, I could see the river of light pouring down its flood of white rays far away in the distance, but only a faint reflection came out to where we passed the night, and then I knew that my faithful companion had led me to the very uttermost limit of the Micaminkis domain before he had halted. Yes, sure enough, for as I raised my eyes, there, towering above the bed, stood the slender crystal column which marked the end of Goggoland. And upon its face I read the extract from a royal decree forbidding a Micaminki to overstep this limit under pain of incurring the Queen's most serious displeasure. Before me was darkness and uncertainty. Behind me lay the fair kingdom of the transparent folk yet in sight, lighted up like a long line of happy homes, in which the fires were blazing bright and warm on the hearthstones. Did I turn back? Did I hesitate? No. I could see a pair of speaking eyes fixed upon me, and could hear a low whine of impatience coaxing me along. Stooping down, I fastened a bit of silken cord taken from the bed to Bulger's collar, and let him lead the way. It was a long while before the light of Queen Crystallina's city faded away entirely, and even when it ceased to be of any service in making known to me the grandeur and beauty of the vast underground passage, I could still see it glitter like a silver star away, away behind me. But it disappeared at last, and then I felt that I had parted forever with the dear little princess with the speck in her heart. Bulger didn't seem to have the slightest difficulty in keeping in the center of the marble highway, and never allowed the leading string to slack up for a moment. However, it was by no means a tramp through utter darkness, for the lizards of which I have already spoken, aroused by the sound of my footfalls, snapped their tails and lighted up their tiny flash torches in eager attempts to discover whence the noise proceeded, and what sort of a being it was that had invaded their silent domains. We had covered possibly 2 leagues when suddenly a low and mysterious voice, as soft and gentle as if it had dropped from the clear, starry heavens of my own beautiful world, reached my ear. "Sebastian, Sebastian," it murmured. Before I could stop to think, I uttered a cry of wonder, and the noise of my voice seemed to awaken 10,000 of the tiny living flashlights inhabiting the cracks and crevices of the vast arched corridor, flooding it for a moment or so with a soft and roseate radiance. "Sebastian, Sebastian," again murmured the mellow and echo-like voice coming from the very walls of rock beside me. Hastily drawing near to the spot whence the words seemed to come, I laid my ear against the smooth face of the rock. Again, the same soft sighing voice pronounced my name so clearly and so close beside me that I reached out to grasp Crystallina's hand, for hers was the voice, the same low, sweet voice that had told me of her sorrow in the spectral garden. But there was no one there. In reaching out, however, I had passed my left hand along the face of the wall, and it had marked the presence of a round, smooth opening in its rocky face, an opening about the size of a rainwater pipe in the upper world. Instantly it flashed upon my mind that through some whim of nature this opening extended for leagues back towards the city of the Mikaminkis, through the miles of solid rock, and opened in the very throne room of the Princess Crystallina. Yes, I was right. For after a moment or so again, the same low, sweet voice came through the speaking tube of nature's own making and fell upon my eager ear. I waited until it had ceased, and setting my mouth in front of the opening, I murmured in strong but gentle tones, "Farewell, dear Princess Crystallina. Bulger and the little Baron both bid thee a long farewell." And then raising Bulger in my arms, I bade him weep for his royal friend whom he would never see again. He gave a long, low, piteous cry, half whine, half howl, and then I listened for Crystallina's voice. It was not long in coming. "Farewell, dear Bulger. Farewell, dear Sebastian. Crystallina will never forget you until her poor heart with the speck in it runs down and the crystal throne knows her no more. Poor Bulger. It now became my turn to tear him from this spot, for Crystallina's voice, sounding thus unexpectedly in his ears, had aroused all the deep affection which he had so ruthlessly smothered in order to bring his little master to his senses and free him from the charm of Crystallina's grace and beauty. But in vain, all my strength, all my entreaties were powerless to move him from the place. Evidently, Crystallina had heard me pleading with Bulger, and had imagined that now I would waver and stand irresolute. "Heed dear Bulger's prayer, O beloved," she pleaded, "and turn back to thy disconsolate Crystallina, whom thou madest so happy for a brief moment. Turn back, oh, turn back." Bulger now began to whine and cry most piteously. I felt that something must be done at once, or the most direful consequences might ensue. That Bulger, crazed by the sweet tones of Crystallina's voice, might break away from me and dart away in a mad race back to the city of the Micaminkis, back to the fair young queen of the Crystal Throne. It became necessary for me to resort to trick and artifice to save my dear little brother from his own loving heart. Drawing his head up against my body and covering his eyes with my left arm, I quickly unloosened my neckerchief and, thrusting it into this wonderful speaking tube, closed it effectively. And thus I saved my faithful Bulger from himself. Thus I closed his ears to the music of Crystallina's voice. But it was not until after a good hour's waiting that he could bring himself to believe that his beloved friend would speak no more. After several hours more of journeying along the marble highway, a speck of light caught my eye, far on ahead, and I redoubled my pace to reach it quickly. I was soon rewarded for my trouble by entering a wonderful chamber, circular in form with a domed roof. In the center of this fair temple of the underground world sprang a glorious fountain with a mighty rush of waters, which brought with them such a phosphorescence that this vast round chamber was lighted up with a pale yellow light, in which the countless crystals of the roof and sides sparkled magnificently. Here we passed the night, or what I called the night, refreshing ourselves with food which I had brought from the kingdom of the Micaminkis, and drinking and bathing in the wonderful fountain which leaped into the air with a rush and a whir, and filled it with a strange and fitful radiance. Upon waking, both Bulger and I felt greatly refreshed both in body and mind, and we made haste to seek out the lofty portal opening upon the marble highway, and were soon trudging along it again. Hour after hour we kept on our feet, for something told me that we could not be far away from the confines of some other domain of this world within a world, and this inward prompting of mine proved to be correct, for Bulger suddenly gave a joyful bark and began to caper about as much as to say, "Oh, little master, if thou only hadst my keen scent, thou wouldst know that we are drawing near to human habitations of some kind." Sure enough, in a few moments a faint light came creeping in beneath the mighty arches of the broad corridor, and every instant it gathered in strength until now I could see clearly about me, and then, all of a sudden, I caught sight of the source of this shy and unsteady light. There, in front of me, towered two gigantic candelabra of carved and chased and polished silver, both crowned with 100 lights, one on each side of the marble highway. Not the dull, soft flames of oil or wax, but the white tongues of fire produced by ignited gas escaping from the chemist's retort. It was marvelous, it was magnificent, and I stood looking up at these great clusters of tongues of flames, spellbound by the glorious illumination thus set in silent majesty at this gateway to some city of the underworld. Bulger's warning growl brought me to myself, but I must end this chapter here, dear friends, and halt to collect my thoughts before I proceed to tell you what I saw after passing this glorious gateway illumined by these two gigantic candelabra of solid silver. Chapter 15. The guards at the Silver Gateway. What they were like. Our reception by them. I make a wonderful discovery. The world's first telephone. Bulger and I succeed in making friends with these strangers. A brief description of the pseudopsies, that is, make-believe eyes, or the formifolk, that is, ant people. How a blind man may read your writing. O great Don Fume, master of all masters, what do I not owe thee for having made known unto me the existence of this wonderful world within a world? Would that I had been a worker in metal, I would not have passed this glorious portal at which I had halted without having set in deep intaglio upon its silver columns the full name of the most glorious scholar whom the world has ever known. Bulger had warned me that this gateway was guarded, and therefore I entered it cautiously, taking care to peer into the dark corners, lest I might be a target for some invisible enemy to hurl a weapon at. No sooner had I passed the gateway than 3 curious little beings about my own height threw themselves swiftly and silently across the patchway. They wore short jackets, knee breeches, and leggings reaching to their ankles, but no hats or shoes, and their clothes were profusely decorated with beautiful silver buttons. Their hands and feet and heads seemed much too large for their little bodies and pipe-stemmy legs, and gave them an uncanny and browny look, which was greatly increased by the staring and glassy expression of their large round eyes. When I first caught sight of them, they had hold of hands, but now they stood each with his pair stretched out towards Bulger and me, waving them strangely in the air and agitating their long fingers as if they were endeavoring to set a spell upon us. I imagined that I could feel a sensation of drowsiness creeping over me and made haste to call out, "Nay, good people, do not strive to set a spell upon me. I am the illustrious explorer from the upper world, Sebastian von Troomp, and come to you with most peaceful intent." But they paid no heed to my words, merely advancing a few inches, and with outstretched hands continued to beat and claw the air, pausing only to signal to each other by touching each other's hands or different parts of each other's bodies. I was deeply perplexed by their actions and took a step or two forward, when instantly they fell back to the same distance. "All men are brothers," I exclaimed in a loud tone, "and carry the same shaped hearts in their breasts. Why do you fear me? You are thrice my number, and in your own home. I pray you, stand fast and speak to me." As I was pronouncing these words, they kept jerking their heads back as if the sound of my voice were smiting them in the face. It was very strange. Suddenly, one of them drew from his pocket a ball of silken cord and, deftly unrolling it, tossed one end toward me. It flew directly towards me, for its end was weighted with a thin disk of polished silver, as was the end retained in the hand of the thrower. His next move was to open his jacket and apparently press his disc against his bare body right over his heart. I made haste to do the same with mine, holding it firmly in place. This done, he retreated a step or two until the silken cord had been drawn quite taut. Then he paused and stood for several instants without moving a muscle, after which he passed the disc to one of his companions, who, having pressed it against his heart in turn, passed it to the third of the group. With the quickness of thought, the truth now burst upon me. The 3 brownie-like creatures in front of me were not only blind, but they were deaf and dumb. The one sense upon which they relied, and in them was of the most marvelous keenness, was the sense of feeling. The strange motions of their hands and fingers, so much like the beating and waving of an insect's feelers, were simply to intercept and measure the vibrations of the air set in motion by the movements of my body. Their large round eyes, too, had but the sense of feeling, but so wondrously acute was it that it was almost like the power of sight, enabling them, by the vibration of the air upon the balls, to tell exactly how near a moving object is to them. Their purpose in throwing the silken cord and silver disc to me was by measuring the beating of my heart and comparing it with their own, to determine whether I was human like them. Judge of my astonishment, dear friends, upon seeing one of their number point to the silver disc, and by means of sign language, give me to understand that they wanted to feel the heart of the living creature in my company. Stooping down, I hastened to gratify their curiosity by applying it over my dear Bulger's heart. At once there was an expression of most comical amazement depicted on their faces as they passed the disc from one to the other and pressed it against different parts of their bodies, now against their breasts, now against their cheeks, and even against their closed eyelids. Of course, I knew that their amazement proceeded from the rapid beating of Bulger's heart, and I enjoyed their childlike surprise very much. All expression of fear now vanished from their faces, and I was delighted with the look of sweet temper and good humor that played about their features, now wreathed in smiles. Slowly and on tiptoe, they drew near to Bulger and me, and for several minutes amused themselves mightily by running their long, flexible fingers hither and thither over our bodies. It did not take them long to discover that I was to all intents and purpose a creature of their own kind, but not so with Bulger. Their round faces became seamed and lined with wonder as they made themselves acquainted with his, to them, strange build, and ever and anon, as they felt him over, they would pause, and in lightning-like motions of their fingers on each other's hands and arms and faces, exchange thoughts as to the wonderful being which had entered the portal of their city. No doubt you are dying of impatience, dear friends, to be told something more definite concerning these strange people among whom I had fallen. Well, know then that their existence had been darkly hinted at in the manuscript of the great master, Don Fume. I say darkly hinted at, for you must bear in mind that Don Fume never visited this world within a world, that his wonderful wisdom enabled him to reason it all without seeing it, just as the great naturalists of our day, upon finding a single tooth belonging to some gigantic creature which lived thousands of years ago, are able to draw complete pictures of him. Well, these curious beings, whose city Bulger and I had entered, are called by two different names in Don Fume's wonderful book. In some places he speaks of them as the pseudopses, or make-believe eyes, and in other as the forma-folk, or ant people. Either name was most appropriate, their large, round, clear eyes being really make-believe ones, for, as I have told you, they had absolutely no sense of sight. While, on the other hand, the fact that they were deaf, dumb, and blind, and lived in underground homes, made them well entitled to the name of ant people. In a few minutes, the three pseudopses had succeeded in teaching me the main principles of their pressure language, so that I was, to their great delight, enabled to answer a number of their questions. But think not, dear friends, that these very wise and active little folk, skilled in so many arts, have no other language than one consisting of pressures of different degree, made by their fingertips upon each other's bodies. They had a most beautiful language, so rich that they were able to express the most difficult thoughts, to give utterance to the most varied emotions. In short, a language quite the equal of ours in all respects save one. It contained absolutely no word that can give them the faintest notion what color was. This is not to be wondered at, for they themselves neither had nor could even the faintest conception of what I meant by color. So that when I attempted to make them understand that our stars were bright points in the sky, they asked me if they would prick my finger if I should press upon one of them. But you doubtless are anxious to know how the forma-folk can possibly make use of any other language than that of pressures. Well, I will tell you. Every pseudopsy carried at his girdle a little blank book, if I may so term it, the covers being of thin silver plates, variously carved and chased as the owner's taste may prompt. The leaves of this book also consist of thin sheets of silver, not much thicker than our tinfoil. Also fastened to his girdle by a silken cord hangs a silver pin, or rather a stylus. Now, when a pseudopsy wishes to say something to one of his people, something too difficult to express by pressures of the fingertips, he simply turns over a leaf of the silver against the inside of either cover, both of which are slightly padded, and taking up his stylus proceeds to write out what he wishes to say. And this done, he deftly tears the leaf out and hands it to his companion, who, taking it and turning it over, runs the wonderfully sensitive tips of his fingers over the raised writing and reads it with the greatest ease. Only, of course, he reads from right to left instead of from left to right, as it was written. So hereafter, when I repeat my conversations with the forma folk, you will understand how they were conducted. Chapter 16. Ideas of the forma folk concerning our upper world. The dancing spectre. Their efforts to lay hold of him. My solemn promise that he should behave himself. We set out for the city of the make-believe eyes. My amazement at the magnificence of the approaches to it. We reach the great bridge of silver, and I get my first glance of the city of Candelabra. Brief account of the wonders spread out before my eyes. Excitement occasioned by our arrival. Our silver bedchamber. Although thousands and thousands of years had gone by since the former folk had, by constant exposure to the flicker and glare of the burning gas which their ancestors had discovered and made use of to illumine their underground world, gradually lost their sense of sight, and then, in consequence of the deep and awful silence that forever reigned about them, had also lost their sense of hearing, and naturally thereafter their power of speech. Yet marvelous to relate, they still kept within their minds dim and shadowy traditions of the upper world, and the mighty lamp, as they called the sun, which burned for 12 hours and then went out, leaving the world in darkness until the spirits of the air could trim it again. And, strange to say, many of the unreal things of the upper world had been by the workings of their minds transformed into realities, while the realities had become the merest cobwebs of the brain. For instance, the shadows cast by our bodies in the sunlight and forever following at our heels, they had come to think were actual creatures, our doubles, so to speak, and that on account of these dancing specters, as they called them, which dogged our footsteps for our life long, sitting like mar-joys at our feasts, it was utterly impossible for the people of the upper world to be entirely happy as they were. And it occurred to them at once that I must have such a double following at my heels, so several times they suddenly joined hands, and forming a circle about me, gradually closed up with intent to lay hold of the dancing spectre. This they did, too, after I had assured them that what they had in mind was the mere shadow cast by a person walking in the light. But as they had absolutely no idea of the nature of light, I only had my trouble for my pains. Nor did they give over making every now and then the most frantic and laughable efforts to catch the little dancing gentleman who, as they were bound to think, was quietly trudging along at my heels, but who, so they informed me, was far quicker in his motions than any escaping water or falling object. Finally, they held one of their silent but very excited powwows, during which the 1,000 lightning-like pressures and tappings which they made upon each other's bodies gave the spectator the idea that they were 3 deaf and dumb schoolboys engaged in a scrimmage over a bag of marbles. And then they informed me that they would resolve to permit Bulger and me to enter the city, provided I would give them the word of a nobleman that I would restrain my nimble-footed double from doing them any harm. I made them a most solemn promise that he should behave himself, whereupon they greeted both Bulger and me as brothers, stroking our hair, patting our heads, and kissing me on the cheeks. And what was more, they told us their names, which were Long Thumbs, Square Nose, and Shaggy Brows. All this time I had been every now and then casting anxious glances on ahead of me, for I was dying of impatience to enter the marvelous city of the ant people. I say marvelous, dear friends, for though many had been the wonderful things I had seen in my lifetime in the faraway corners of the upper world, yet here was a sight which, as it gradually unfolded itself before my eyes, shackled my very heart and caused me to gasp for breath. It was with no little surprise at the very outset that I discovered that the walls and floors of the beautiful passage through which the Pseudopsies were leading Bulger and me were of pure silver, the former being composed of polished panels ornamented with finely executed chasings and carvings, and the latter, as had in fact all the floors and streets and passages of the city, having upon their polished surfaces slightly raised characters, which I will explain later. But as one passage opened into another, and then 4 or more all centered in a vast circular chamber, which we traversed with our 3 silent guides, only to enter chambers and corridors of greater size and beauty, all brilliantly lighted by rows of the same glorious candelabra upholding clusters of tongues of flame. I could compare the scene to nothing save a series of magnificent ballrooms and banquet halls, out of which the happy guests had been suddenly driven by the deep and awful rumble of an earthquake shock, the lights having been left burning. Now the scene began to change. Long Thumbs, who was leading the way, and in whose large palm my little hand lay completely lost, suddenly turned to the right and led me up an arched way. I saw that we were crossing a bridge over a stream as black and sluggish as Leith itself.
But such a bridge, never had my eye rested upon so light and airy a span, springing from bank to bank. Not the plain and solid work of the stonemason, but the fair and cunning result of the metalworker's skill, like the labor of love, delicate yet strong, and almost too beautiful for use. 2 rows of silver lamps of exquisite workmanship crowned its gracefully arching sides, and when we stood upon its highest bend, Long Thumbs halted and wrote upon his tablet. Now, little baron, we are about to enter the dwelling place of our people. Thy head is large, and there is no doubt much of wisdom stored away in thy brain. Make such use of it as not to disturb the perfect happiness of our nation, for no doubt many of our people will be suspicious of thee, and for the first time in thousands of years a Pseudopsy will lay him down to sleep, and in his dreams feel the touch of the dancing spectre of the upper world. I promised Long Thumbs that he should have no reason to be dissatisfied with me, and then, making an excuse that I was a-weary, I feasted my eyes for several moments upon the glorious scene spread out before me. It was the city of the Formifolk in all of its splendor, a splendor, alas, unseen by, unknown to, the very people dwelling in it, for to them its silver walls and arches, its endless rows of glorious candelabra uplifting their countless clusters of never-dying jets of flame, its exquisitely carved and chiseled portals and gateways, its graceful chairs and settees and beds and couches and tables and lamps and basins and ewers and thousands of articles of furniture all in purest silver, hammered or wrought by the cunning hands of their ancestors while they were still possessed of their power of sight, could only be known to these, their descendants, by the soul's sense of feeling. From the lofty ceilings of corridors and archways, from the jutting ornaments of the house fronts, from cornice and coping, from the 4 sides of columns, and from the corners of cupolas and minarets, here and there and everywhere, hung silver lamps of more than oriental beauty of form and finish, all with their never-dying tongues of flame sending forth a soft though unsteady light to fall upon a sightless eyes. And yet these countless flames, by the aid of which I was enabled to gaze upon the splendor of this city of silver palaces, were life, if not light, to the Pseudopsies, for they warmed these vast subterranean depths and filled them with a deliciously soft and strangely balmy air. And yet to think that Bulger and I were the only 2 living creatures to be able to look upon this scene of almost celestial beauty and radiance. It made me sad and plunged me into such a fit of deep abstraction that it required a second gentle tug of Long Thumbs' hand to bring me to myself. As we crossed the bridge and entered the city proper, I was delighted to note that the streets and open squares were ornamented with hundreds of statues, all in solid silver, and that they represented specimens of a race of great beauty of person. And then it occurred to me how fortunate it was that the Pseudopsies could not gaze upon these images of their ancestors, and thus become living witnesses of their own woeful falling away from the former physical grace of their race. Now, like human ants they were, the Formifolk began to swarm forth from their dwellings on every side of the city, and my keen ear caught the low shuffling sound of their bare feet over the silver streets as they closed in about us, their arms flashing in the light and their faces lined with strange emotions as they learned of the arrival among them of 2 creatures from the upper world. They were all clad, men and women alike, in silk garments of a chestnut brown, and I at once concluded that they drew this material from the same sources as the Micaminkis. For, dear friends, you must not get an idea that the Formifolk were not well deserving of the name which Don Fume had bestowed upon them. They were genuine human ants, and, except when sleeping, always at work. It was true that since their blindness had come upon them, they had not been able to add a single column or archway to the Silver City. But in all the ordinary concerns of life, they were quite as industrious as ever, chasing, carving, chiseling, planting, weaving, knitting, and doing 1,001 things that you and I, with our 2 good eyes, would find it hard to accomplish. I had made known to Long Thumbs the fact that Bulger and I were both very tired and weary from our long tramp, and that we craved to have some refreshment set before us, and then to be permitted to go to rest at once, promising that after we had had several hours' good sleep, we would take the greatest pleasure in being presented to the worthy inhabitants of the Silver City. It was astonishing with what rapidity this quest of mine spread from man to man. Long Thumbs made it known to 2 at the same time, and these 2 to 4, and these 4 to 8, these 8 to 16, and so on. You see, it wouldn't take long at that rate to tell 1,000,000. Like magic, the former folk disappeared from the streets, and in a sort of orderly confusion faded from my sight. Bulger and I were right glad to be conducted to a silver bed chamber, where the traveler's every want seemed to be anticipated. The only thing that bothered us was we had not been accustomed to keep the light burning upon going to bed, and this made us both a little wakeful at first, but we were too tired to let it keep us from dropping off after a few moments, for the mattress was soft and springy enough to satisfy anyone, and I'm sure that no one could have complained that the house wasn't quiet enough.
Chapter 17, in which you read, dear friends, something about a live alarm clock and a Sodopsy bather in rubber. Our first breakfast in the City of Silver. A new way to catch fish without hurting their feelings. How the streets and houses were numbered, and where the signboards were. A very original library in which books never get dog-eared. How Velvet Souls enjoyed her favorite poets. I am presented to the learned Barrel Brow, who proceeds to give me his views of the upper world. They entertained me amazingly and may interest you. I can't tell you, dear friends, exactly how long Bulger and I slept, but it must have been a good while, for when I was awakened I felt thoroughly refreshed. I say awakened, for I was awakened by a gentle tapping on the back of my hand, 6 taps. At first I thought I was dreaming, but upon rubbing my eyes I saw standing by the side of my bed one of the Sodopsies who, feeling me stir, took up his tablet and wrote as follows. My name is Taphard. I am a clock. There is a score of us. We keep the time for the people by counting the swing of the pendulum in the time house. It swings about as fast as we breathe. There are 100 breaths to a minute and 100 minutes to an hour. Our day is divided into 6 hours work time and 6 hours sleep time. It is now the rising hour. If thou wilt be pleased to rise, one of our people from the health house will rub all the tired out of thy limbs. I touched Taphard's heart to thank him, and made haste to scramble out of bed. Now, for the first time, I looked about the silver chamber in which I had slept. On silver shelves lay silver combs, and silver shears, and silver knives. On a silver stand stood a silver ewer within a silver basin. On silver pegs hung silken towels, while spread upon the silver floor lay soft silken rugs. And above and round, on ceiling and walls, the tongues of flame were 1,000 times repeated in the panels of burnished silver. I had made trial of all sorts of oriental rubber and bath attendants in my day, but the silent little Sodopsy, who laved and rubbed and tapped and stroked me, exceeded them all in dexterity, added to which was a new charm, for I was not obliged to listen to long and senseless tales of adventure and intrigue, but was left quite alone to my own thoughts. Bulger was also treated to a sponging and a rubbing, a luxury which he had not enjoyed since we had left Castle Troomp. My toilet was no sooner completed than Long Thumbs made his appearance to inquire after my health and to superintend the serving of my breakfast, which consisted of a piece of most delicate boiled fish flanked with oysters of delicious flavor, and trimmed with slices of those monstrous mushrooms which I had eaten among the Mickaminkies, the whole served in a beautiful silver dish on a silver tray with silver eating utensils. Remembering the strange way in which the fish were caught and killed in the land of the Mickaminkies, I was curious to know how the Sodopsies managed it, for I knew enough of them to know that the sensation of anything struggling for its life in their hands would suffice to throw them into fits of great suffering, to fill their gentle hearts with nameless terror.
At the end of one of the many corridors leading out of our city, explained Longthumbs, there is a rocky chamber which was called by our ancestors Uphuslok, or the Death Hole, because any being which breathes its air for a few moments is sure to die. They closed it up forever, leaving only a small pipe projecting through the door. But, strange to say, those who breathe this air suffer no pain whatever, but presently drop off into a pleasant dream, and unless they be rescued, would of course never wake again. Now, as our laws forbid us to cause any pain to the most insignificant creature, it occurred to our ancestors that by means of a long pipe, they could turn this poisoned air into the river whenever they wanted a supply of fish for food. This they did, and strange to say, the moment the fish felt the gas bubbling into the river, they at once swam up to the mouth of the pipe and struggled with each other for a chance to catch the deadly bubbles as they left its mouth. So pleasant a sensation do they cause as they gradually plunge, the creature breathing them into his last sleep. And in this way it is we are enabled to feed upon the fish in our river without breaking the law of the land. I began to understand that I had fallen in with a very original and interesting folk, but Bulger was not altogether pleased with them, for several reasons, as I soon observed. In the first place, he couldn't accustom himself to the cold and glassy look of their eyes, and in the next, he was a bit jealous of their wonderfully keen scent, a sense which with them was so strong that they invariably gave signs of him being conscious of Bulger's approach even before I could see him, and always turned their faces in the direction in which he was coming. You will remember, dear friends, that I mentioned the fact that the former folk went barefoot, and that their feet, as well as their hands, seemed altogether too large for their bodies. And I wish to add that while Bulger and I were being led through the long corridors and winding passages on our way into the City of Silver, the three Sidopsies frequently half halted and seemed to be feeling on the floor for something within the balls of their feet. I thought no more about it until Bulger and I started out for our first stroll through their wonderful town, when, to my great delight, I made the discovery that the numbers of the houses, the names of the occupants, the names of the streets, as well as all signboards, so to speak, and all guideposts, were in slightly raised letters on the floors and pavements. And then the truth dawned upon me, that Longthumbs and his companions were simply halting now and then to read the names of the streets with the balls of their feet, in order to know if they were taking the right road. Aye, more than this, dear friends. The first time Bulger and I passed through one of the open squares of the City of Silver, you may imagine my satisfaction upon the discovery that the silver pavements were literally carved with the writings of the Sidopsi authors in raised characters. Now in Don Fum's wonderful book, he had, in his masterly manner, given me the key to the language of the Formifolk, so that with very slight effort I was able to make the additional discovery that some of the streets were given up to the writers of history, and some to story writers, while others were filled with the learned works of philosophers, and others still contained many thousands of lines from the best poets which the nation had produced. And I had very little difficulty in discovering which were the favorite poems of the Sidopsies, for as you may readily suppose, these were polished like a silver mirror by the shuffling of the many thankful feet over their sweet and soulful lines. I noticed that the writings of the philosophers in this, as in my own world, found few readers, for the raised letters were in many cases tarnished and black from lack of souls trampling over them in search of wisdom. Somewhat later, when I had become acquainted with Velvet Souls, the daughter of Longthumbs, a gracious little being, as full of inward light as she was blind to the outer world, and she invited me to come for a read. I had a hard task of it in persuading her that I could not remove what she called my ridiculous footboxes, and join her in enjoying some of her favorite poems. It was to me a delicious pastime to accompany this happy little maiden when she went for a read, to walk beside her and watch the ever-varying expression of her beautiful face as the soles of her tiny feet pressed the words of love and hope and joy, and her heart expanded and she clasped her hands in attitudes of blissful enjoyment, seemingly just as deep and fervent as if the blessed sunlight rested on her brow, and her eyes were drinking in the glory of a summer sunset. O dwellers in the upper world, with the light streaming into the windows of your souls, with your ears open to the music of pipe and flute and violin, and to the sweeter music of the voice of love, how much more have ye than she, and yet how rarely are ye as happy? How rarely do ye know that sweet contentment which, as in this case, came from within? Go to the ant, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. In a short time the former folk seemed to become quite accustomed to having Bulger and me among them, and they apparently touched hands with me in quite as friendly a fashion as if I had been one of them. One day Long Thumbs conducted me to the house of the most aged and learned of the Sidopses, Barrel Brow by name. He received me very cordially, although I interrupted him at his studies, for as I entered his apartment, he was in the act of reading 4 different books at the same time. 2 were lying on the floor, and as he was perusing their raised characters with the soles of his feet, 2 others were set up on a frame in front of him, and he was deciphering with the tips of his fingers. But when informed who I was, he stopped work at once, and taking up his tablets, asked me a number of questions concerning the upper world, of which he had, however, no very exalted opinion. You people, said he, if I understand correctly the ancient writings of those of our nation who still preserved certain traditions of the upper world, are endowed with several senses which are utterly lacking in us. I am happy to say, for if I understand correctly, ye have in the first place a sense which ye call hearing, a most troublesome sense, for by means of it ye are being constantly disturbed and annoyed by vibrations of the air coming from afar. Now, they can be of no possible good to you. You might as well have a sense that would inform you what was going on in the moon. Therefore, my conclusion is that the sense of hearing only serves to distract and weaken the brain. Another sense that ye are possessed of, continued Barrel Brow, ye call the sense a sight, a power even more useless and distracting than hearing, for the reason that it enables you to know things which it is utterly bootless to know, such as what your next-door neighbors may be doing, how the mountains are acting on the other side of your rivers, how your sky, as ye call it, might fill if you could touch it with your fingers, which ye can't do, however. How soon rain will fall, which is a useless piece of knowledge if ye have roofs to cover you, as I suppose ye have. But the most ridiculous use which ye make of this sense of sight is in the manufacture of what you call pictures, by means of which ye seem to take the greatest pleasure in deceiving this very sense of which ye are so very proud. If I understand correctly, these pictures, if felt of, are quite as smooth as that panel there, but so cunningly do ye draw the lines and lay in the colors, whatever they may be, that ye really succeed in deceiving yourselves and stand for hours in front of one of these bits of trickery when ye might, if ye choose, feast your eyes, as ye call it, upon the very thing which the trickster has imitated. Now, as life is much shorter in the upper world than in ours, it seems very strange to me that ye should waste it in this foolish manner. Then there is another thing, little baron, continued the learned Barrel Brow, which I wish to mention. It is this: the people of the upper world pride themselves very much upon what they term the power of speech, which, if I understand correctly, is a faculty they have of expressing their thoughts to each other by violently expelling the air from their lungs, and that this air, rushing into the ventilators of the brain which ye call ears, produces a sensation of sound, as ye term it. And in this way one of thy people standing at one end of the town might make his wishes known to another standing at the other end. Now, thou wilt pardon my thinking so, little baron, but this seems to me to be not a whit above the brute creature, which, opening its vast jaws, thus sets the air in motion and calling its young, or breathing defiance at an enemy. And if I understand correctly, little baron, So proud are thy people of this power of speech that they insist upon making use of it at all times and upon all occasions. And strange to say, these talkers can always find plenty of people to open their ears to these vibrations of the air, although the effect is so wearying to the brain that in the end they invariably fall asleep. But if I understand correctly, the women are even fonder of displaying their skill and thus puffing out the air from their lungs than the men are. But that not satisfied with the superior power of puffing out the words, they actually have recourse to a potent herb which they steep in boiling water and drink as hot as possible, on account of its effects in loosening the tongue and allowing the talker to do more puffing than she could otherwise. But all this, little baron, continued the learned Barrelbrow, might be overlooked and regarded in the light of mere amusement, were it not for the fact, if I understand correctly, that brain ventilators being of different sizes in different persons, the consequence is that these puffs of air which you use to make known your thoughts to each other produce different effects upon different persons, and the result is that the people of the upper world spend half their time repeating the puffs which they have already sent out, and that even though thou canst rarely find two people who will agree exactly as to the number, kind, strength, and meaning of the puffs blown into each other's brain ventilators, and that therefore has it become necessary to provide what ye call judges to settle these disputes which often last for lifetimes. The two parties spending their entire fortunes hiring witnesses to come before these judges and imitate the sound which the air made when it was set in motion years ago by the angry puffs of the two parties. I sincerely trust, little baron, wrote the learned brow on his tablet of silver, that when thou returnest to thy people thou wilt make known to them that I have written for thee today, for it is never too late to correct a fault, and the longer that fault has lasted, the greater the credit for correcting it. I promised the learned Sodopsy to do as he requested, and then we touched each other on the back of the head, which is the way they say goodbye in the land of the Formifolk, a touch on the forehead meaning, how do you do?